Rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. Vivian Cross stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the penthouse, watching the city blur beneath sheets of water, and she thought about how a person could disappear inside a marriage the same way a street disappears inside a flood, slowly, then all at once, until you couldn't remember what the ground looked like dry. She had a black ledger in her hand. She'd had it for 4 months. Tonight, she was going to put it on the table. Matteo was in the study with the door closed, doing what he always did, making decisions about people's lives while she stood in rooms that cost more than most people earned in a decade, feeling like furniture with a pulse. She could hear the low murmur of his voice through the wall. She couldn't make out words. She never could. That was intentional. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and made herself breathe. She thought about the woman she'd been at 26, the year she met Matteo Rourke at a charity gala on the 43rd floor of a building she'd only entered because she was catering the event. She'd been hauling a tray of champagne flutes when he stepped in front of her, not looking where he was going, and she'd pulled up short so hard the glasses nearly toppled. He'd caught the tray. She'd looked up. He was already looking at her. That was the whole story of how it started, and she'd told it at dinner parties 100 times, and it always got a warm laugh and a collective sigh from the women at the table. What she never told anyone, not even her sister, not even her closest friend from before, was what she'd thought in that exact moment when their eyes met. She'd thought, this man is dangerous, and she'd smiled at him anyway. The intercom beside the door crackled. Mrs. Rourke? It was Harlan, the head of security. His voice had the texture of gravel that had been ground down to fine powder. Mr. Rourke will be out shortly. He asked me to let you know. Thank you, Harlan. She didn't move from the window. Harlan had been with Matteo for 11 years. He'd watched Vivian move into the penthouse. He'd watched her redecorate 3 rooms and then stop, as if she'd run out of either ideas or motivation. He'd watched her plant a small herb garden on the terrace that she tended every morning when the weather allowed, and he'd watched her stop tending it sometime around February without explanation. Harlan never commented on any of it. He was good at that, at seeing everything and saying nothing, which was probably why Matteo trusted him more than almost anyone else on earth. Vivian had never told Matteo that she'd caught Harlan watching her with an expression that looked disturbingly close to pity. She'd never told Matteo a lot of things. The ledger was proof of that. She heard the study door open. Matteo moved through rooms the way he moved through negotiations, with a kind of unhurried certainty that made other people feel like they were the ones intruding. He was 43 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that had started going silver at the temples in the last 2 years. He wore his clothes the way he wore everything, like they'd been made specifically for him, which they had been. He had a glass of bourbon in his hand that was more ice than liquor at this point, and his eyes, when they landed on Vivian, were the particular shade of tired that she recognized as post-meeting exhaustion. He had no idea what was about to happen. That was the part that hit her hardest when she thought about it later. Not the conversation itself, not the thing she said, or the thing he said back, but the simple, devastating fact that Matteo Rourke, a man who had built an entire criminal empire on the ability to anticipate threats, had absolutely no idea that his wife was about to blow a hole through everything. "You're still up," he said. "I've been up." He set the bourbon down on the side table and looked at her more carefully. He was good at reading rooms. He'd learned it young and refined it over decades. He could walk into a warehouse negotiation and know within 30 seconds who was frightened, who was lying, and who was the one actually in charge, regardless of who was doing the most talking. He'd built his career on that ability. Looking at Vivian across the living room of their penthouse, he got nothing. Or maybe he got something and chose not to examine it. She never decided which. "Long night," he said, "for both of us." He pulled at his collar, loosening it, a small gesture. She'd watched him make it 10,000 times. It was the gesture that meant the formal part of the day is over. Now I'm just a man in a room. She used to find it almost unbearably human. The great Matteo Rourke, terror of organized crime across 4 states, pulling at his collar because it pinched his neck. Now she just watched it and felt nothing move inside her. That was when she knew she'd made the right decision. "There's something I need to show you," she said. She put the ledger on the coffee table between them. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't throw it. She didn't slam it down. She set it down flat, the way you'd set down a bill at a restaurant, and she straightened up and looked at him. Matteo looked at the ledger. He didn't touch it. "What is this?" It wasn't a question exactly. It had the shape of a question, but the tone of a man who already suspected the answer wasn't going to be good. Open it, Vivian said. Vivian, open it, Matteo. He picked it up. He opened it. She watched his face. She'd spent 6 years studying that face across dinner tables and in the back seats of armored cars and over the shoulders of men who thought she wasn't paying attention. She knew every version of it. The public face he used for business, the private face he used for her, the controlled face he put on when something went wrong, and he needed everyone around him to believe it hadn't. She knew the face he made when he was genuinely surprised, which happened rarely, and she knew the face he made when he was pretending not to be surprised, which happened constantly. What she saw now was neither of those. What she saw was the face Matteo Rourke made when something frightened him. She had seen it exactly twice before. Once when she'd been in a car accident on the highway, and he'd arrived at the hospital before the paramedics had finished their paperwork. Once when his younger brother had disappeared for 48 hours and turned up drunk in Atlantic City with no memory of the previous 2 days. Both times, the fear had been followed immediately by cold, precise, controlled action. She braced for that now. "Where did you get this?" he said. His voice was very quiet. "I've been building it for 4 months. He stopped. He turned a page, then another. "This is Damien's. I know whose it is. These account numbers, I know what they are." He looked up at her. Something had shifted in his expression. It wasn't fear anymore. It was something worse. It was the look of a man recalibrating, updating, running calculations she couldn't see. "How long have you known about Damien?" he said. "Since the night of the Fenwick dinner, 4 months ago." The muscle in his jaw tightened. She watched it happen. "You sat on this for 4 months." "I did." "Why?" She looked at him for a long moment before she answered. "Because I needed to decide what I was going to do with it." Matteo set the ledger down. He walked to the window, her window, the one she'd been standing at 20 minutes ago, and stood with his back to her, looking at the rain. She watched the set of his shoulders, watched the small movements of his hands. He was thinking. When Matteo was genuinely thinking, he went very still and very quiet, the way water goes still, right before it goes over the edge. "You should have come to me immediately," he said. "I know that's what you think." "It's not what I think. It's what's true. Damien Vale has been my right hand for 8 years. If he's been building a separate structure, he has. Then every person in my organization has been at risk for God knows how long, and you sat on evidence of it for 4 months while what?" Her voice came out harder than she intended. "While you made decisions about our life and never once included me in any of them? While you told me to stay out of your business and meant it so absolutely that you stopped telling me anything, Matteo? Even the things I needed to know to be safe?" He turned around. "You are safe. I was nearly followed home from the farmer's market 2 months ago by a man I didn't recognize and whom I later identified from your files as one of Damien's personal contractors. So," she looked at him steadily, "don't tell me I'm safe." The silence that followed was the loudest silence of their marriage, and their marriage had had some significant silences. Matteo crossed the room. He stopped 6 feet from her, which was not close enough to be intimate and not far enough to be comfortable. He looked at her the way he looked at things he didn't entirely understand, with a kind of intense, frustrated focus that almost resembled respect. "You identified him from my files," he said slowly. "Yes." "You accessed my files." "I did." "How long have you been—" He stopped, restarted. "How much do you know, Vivian?" She held his gaze. "Enough." That was the word that cracked it open. Not the ledger, not the 4 months of silence, not even the revelation about Damien, which was genuinely catastrophic by any reasonable measure. Enough. She watched it land on him. Watched him understand, in the space of that one word, that his wife, the woman he'd kept carefully outside the walls of his world for 6 years, the woman he'd told himself he was protecting, had not been outside those walls at all. She'd been inside them, quietly, systematically, with a patience and precision that, if he was being honest with himself, rivaled anything his own people had ever demonstrated. "I'm not here to threaten you," she said. "I want you to understand that. I didn't build this ledger to use against you. I built it because someone inside your organization was eliminating people who got too close, and I was getting close, and I needed—" Her voice caught, just slightly, just once. I needed to be able to protect myself since you'd stopped doing it. The color that moved through Matteo's face was not something she had a name for. I never stopped. You stopped including me, which is the same thing from where I stand. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Vivian, I'm done begging you, she said. She said it the way you say something you've rehearsed so many times it stops feeling like words and starts feeling like breathing, quietly, completely. Without inflection, because the inflection had been used up months ago, and what was left was just the bare fact of it. I'm done begging you to see me. I'm done begging you to let me in. I'm done begging you to choose me over a business that's going to end with either of us in a box or a cage, and I'm done waiting for you to figure out that I was worth choosing. She picked up the small bag she'd left by the side table. Matteo looked at it for the first time. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he should have noticed an hour ago. You're leaving. Yes. Tonight. Right now. He didn't move. She had expected him to move, expected him to step forward, to reach for her arm, to do the thing powerful men do when they feel something slipping out of their control. Matteo had always been controlled, but he was also a man who did not lose things quietly when he could help it. But he didn't move. He stood in the middle of their living room, in the penthouse she'd decorated, and then stopped decorating, with the black ledger on the coffee table between them, and he watched her walk to the door. She had her hand on the handle when he finally spoke. Where will you go? She turned, just her face, not her body. Somewhere you don't know about, she said, which shouldn't be hard. You don't know much about my life anymore. She opened the door. She walked through it. She did not look back. The elevator took 45 seconds to descend 41 floors. Vivian counted them. She needed to count something, needed the small mechanical certainty of numbers moving in one direction, because everything else in her body was moving in 17 directions simultaneously, and she couldn't afford to fall apart in an elevator. 29, 30, 31. She had made arrangements 3 weeks ago when she'd finally admitted to herself that this was the direction things were heading. A car, registered under a name that connected to a shell entity Damien Vale would recognize. Not because she wanted Damien to find her, but because she needed Matteo to understand, when he found the registration, that she had been operating several moves ahead of everyone in that building. The elevator opened into the parking garage. The car was where she'd left it. She got in, started the engine, and sat for exactly 60 seconds with her hands on the wheel and the engine running and the rain audible even underground. Then she pulled out. She drove for 2 hours without stopping. The city peeled back gradually, shedding its glass towers and arterial highways, going soft at the edges into the kind of neighborhoods where people knew their neighbors' names, and arguments about lawn maintenance were the most dangerous things happening on a Tuesday night. Vivian drove through all of it without seeing it, or seeing it the way you see things when you're thinking hard about something else, peripherally, in patches, without context. She was thinking about Damien. She had met him 47 times in 6 years. She had counted later when she started keeping the ledger. 47 interactions across dinners and holiday gatherings, and the rare occasion when Matteo brought him along to something social, which Vivian had always found mildly unsettling without being able to articulate exactly why. Now she could articulate it. Damien Vale had been, for 8 years, the second most powerful person in Matteo Rourke's organization. He managed territories, handled negotiations, oversaw the people who oversaw other people. He was efficient and quiet, and had a quality that Vivian could only describe as practiced warmth, a simulation of genuine friendliness, so sophisticated that it fooled most people most of the time. It hadn't fooled her. She wasn't sure exactly when she'd started doubting him. Sometime in the 3rd year of her marriage, she thought. Something small, a discrepancy in the way he described an event that she'd been present for, a subtle misframing that could have been misremembering but felt, in the moment, deliberate. She'd filed it. She was good at filing things. She'd been filing things for 6 years. The ledger was the physical manifestation of what happened when Vivian Cross filed things. She stopped at a rest area off the highway and sat in the parking lot with the engine idling. She opened her phone. There were 3 missed calls from Matteo. No messages. That was characteristic. Matteo did not leave messages when he was upset because he'd learned long ago that recorded words were liabilities. He called until you answered. She stared at his name on the screen. She thought about the first time she'd told him she loved him, which had happened in an airport terminal at 6 in the morning during a layover in Detroit that had already lasted 2 hours. She'd said it sideways, half asleep, leaning against his shoulder, and he'd gone completely still for a moment before kissing the top of her head. He hadn't said it back for 11 days. When he finally did, it was in the middle of an argument about something entirely unrelated. She couldn't even remember what. And he just stopped mid-sentence and said it, flat and blunt, and with the specific helplessness of a man who hadn't meant to admit anything. "I love you, Vivian. I don't know what to do with that, but there it is." She locked her phone and put it in the glove box. There it was. The safe house was a rented apartment above a hardware store in a town 40 miles from the city. She'd arranged it through a contact she'd cultivated carefully over 18 months, a woman named Delphine who worked in property management, and who knew better than to ask questions because Vivian had answered the only question that mattered, which was whether she paid reliably and in advance. She did. The apartment was small. 2 rooms and a bathroom and a kitchen the size of a large closet. It smelled like sawdust from the store below, and old coffee from whoever had lived here before. The furniture was clean but worn, the kind of furniture that had survived several tenants and would survive several more. Vivian set her bag down on the floor. She stood in the middle of the small living room and let herself feel the specific gravity of what she'd done. She'd walked out on Matteo Rourke. She'd walked out on Matteo Rourke with a ledger full of evidence of his most trusted lieutenant's multi-year betrayal. And she'd walked out on Matteo Rourke knowing that when he finally fully processed what she'd taken, not money, not property, but information, leverage, the kind of thing that could alter the balance of power in an organization and trigger very dangerous people to do very dangerous things. The situation was going to escalate quickly. She also knew that she was right now the safest she'd been in months. Because as long as Matteo was looking for her, Damien Vale's people couldn't get to her without going through Matteo's people first. She'd calculated this too. She slept for 4 hours. Not deeply. She was not a person who slept deeply in new places, and she was not a person who slept deeply when her nervous system was running at the frequency it was currently running at. But she slept, which was more than she'd expected. She woke at 5:40 in the morning to the sound of rain, which hadn't stopped, and lay in the narrow bed in the borrowed apartment and thought about the look on Matteo's face when he'd opened the ledger. She'd expected anger. She'd gotten fear. That distinction had mattered more than she'd anticipated. She'd spent months imagining that moment, running through the possible versions of it. The version where he was furious, the version where he went cold, the version where he tried to contain it immediately, to turn the conversation into a negotiation. She'd prepared for all of those versions. She hadn't prepared for the version where he looked afraid. It complicated things. It complicated them because it reminded her that Matteo Rourke, beneath the empire and the bodyguards and the steel-reinforced walls of deliberate mystery, was a person. A flawed, complicated, frequently infuriating person who had made choices she couldn't forgive and who had also, at 6 in the morning in a Detroit airport terminal, held very still for a moment before kissing the top of her head. She got up. She made coffee in the inadequate kitchen. She sat at the small table by the window and opened her laptop and began reviewing the secondary files she'd copied before leaving the penthouse. Not the ledger itself, which she'd left on the coffee table deliberately, but the digital records she'd been quietly accumulating, the ones that mapped Damien Vale's secondary network with a precision she was fairly certain neither Matteo nor Damien knew existed. Because the ledger on the coffee table was not, in fact, the most dangerous thing Vivian had taken. It was the most visible thing. The most dangerous thing was in the laptop. She'd found the first thread 8 months ago. She hadn't been looking for it. She'd been trying to track down a discrepancy in the household accounts. A recurring payment to a vendor she didn't recognize, which could have been innocent, and probably was innocent, and which she would normally not have spent more than 10 minutes investigating. But the vendor name didn't match any of the legitimate suppliers in the files she had access to, and the amounts were irregular in a way that felt wrong. And Vivian had learned long ago to pay attention when something felt wrong, even if she couldn't articulate exactly why. She'd pulled the thread. It had taken her 3 months to follow it to where it led, which was to a series of shell corporations nested inside each other like Russian dolls, the innermost of which was connected to a property in a city 2 states away that Matteo had no knowledge of, and Damien Vale's mother had no apparent means to own outright. She'd sat with that discovery for a week. Then she'd kept pulling. By the third month, she understood what she was looking at. Damien Vale had been building a parallel organization for at minimum 4 years. He'd been doing it slowly, deliberately, using the access and resources Matteo's operation provided to quietly establish his own independent network, one that could, in theory, absorb the assets and operations of Matteo's empire if Matteo was no longer around to run it. He was not planning a coup in the traditional sense. He was planning something more sophisticated, a managed transition in which Matteo's operation would be destabilized and then dismantled while Damien's new structure stepped seamlessly into the vacuum. For that to work, anyone who might resist, anyone who might expose the structure before it was ready, or who might rally support for Matteo in the aftermath, needed to be dealt with. She had identified 3 people in the previous 18 months who had been in positions to discover what Damien was building. One had died in what was ruled an accident. One had simply disappeared. One was in prison on charges that, when Vivian traced the informant chain backward, connected in disturbing ways to Damien's secondary network. 3 people. She had spent a long, very quiet Sunday in February sitting at this very table, in this apartment she'd rented months before she needed it, thinking about those 3 people and about what it meant that she was now someone who knew what they had known. She had thought, very specifically, I am not going to be the 4th. Her phone rang at 7:15. It wasn't Matteo. The number was one she recognized but hadn't expected, Carla Sims, who had been Matteo's personal attorney for 6 years, and who occupied that particular category of person that Vivian thought of as adjacent loyalists, people whose allegiance was fundamentally to the enterprise rather than to any individual within it, which meant their loyalties could shift with the tides. She let it ring 3 times before answering. Carla. Vivian. A pause. Are you somewhere safe? Why are you asking me that? Because Matteo has had everyone he employs looking for you since 3 this morning, and I just got a call from someone in his security apparatus who told me something that you need to know before you make any decisions about where to go or what to do next. Vivian set down her coffee. What did they tell you? Another pause. Longer. The kind of pause that a person who has delivered bad news before uses to brace the listener without actually doing anything to soften the news itself. Damien knows you left, Carla said. He knows about the ledger, and he has people looking for you too. The information landed and rearranged several things simultaneously. Vivian stood up from the table. Not urgently. She didn't have the luxury of urgency right now because urgency produced errors, and she could not afford errors. She stood up because sitting felt suddenly untenable, and she walked to the window and looked at the rain-soaked street below and let the information settle into the framework she'd already built. Damien knew. Which meant one of 2 things. Either Matteo had told him, possible but unlikely, because Matteo's first instinct when betrayed was to gather information before confronting, or Damien had his own surveillance on the penthouse. The second possibility was the more significant one. How did Damien find out? She said. We don't know, Carla said. That's part of what has Matteo's people moving quickly. If Damien has visibility into the penthouse, he has surveillance on Matteo. Then the scope of what he's built is considerably larger than anyone knew. I knew, Vivian said quietly. A pause. What? The surveillance on the penthouse isn't new. Damien's been running it for at least 14 months. I found evidence of the access point 7 months ago. I didn't dismantle it because I didn't want him to know that I knew. The silence on the other end of the line had a particular texture. Vivian, Carla said slowly, how much of this have you been holding? Vivian looked at the laptop on the table, at the files arranged in neat folders on the desktop, each labeled with dates and account numbers, and a single-word descriptor that captured the essence of what was inside. Months of quiet, meticulous, invisible work. The record of everything she'd learned in the margins of a marriage that had slowly, inexorably turned her from a wife into a witness. Enough, she said. That word again. You need to move, Carla said. Not because of Matteo. He wants you found, but he wants you found so he can... She stopped. He's scared for you, Vivian. Whatever else you're thinking about him right now, the man is scared. I know. Then you know that the threat isn't from his side. The threat is from Damien's people, who have no reason to care about what Matteo wants, and every reason to want to contain what you know before. I understand the mechanics, Carla. Then move. She moved. She repacked the bag in 7 minutes flat. She wiped down the surfaces she'd touched, not because she thought it would be adequate protection against a serious effort to trace her, but because the act of it was steadying. It required focus, sequence, specificity, and right now she needed all three. She folded the laptop into its case. She stood at the door for exactly 5 seconds, doing a last visual sweep of the apartment. Then she walked out and didn't look back. The car she'd driven here was registered under the Shell name. She left it in the lot. She'd anticipated this possibility and arranged for a second vehicle, so a cash purchase from a private seller 3 weeks ago, registered clean, parked 2 streets over. She walked through the rain to find it. She was soaked through by the time she got there. She didn't stop to think about it. She got in, started the engine, and sat for a moment with the heater running and her wet hands on the wheel. She thought about Damien Vale's face at the last dinner she'd attended where he was present, 8 weeks ago, a small gathering at a restaurant Matteo favored. 6 people at a table, food and wine, and the kind of conversation that circles important things without ever landing on them. Damien had been charming. He'd asked about her herb garden on the terrace, which she'd found mildly uncanny at the time because she'd never mentioned it to him. Now she knew why he'd known about it. The surveillance. She pulled into traffic and drove. She needed somewhere to go that was not the safe house, which was compromised, and not anywhere connected to her own name or history, and not anywhere Damien's people could anticipate based on pattern. She called the only person she trusted completely. "I need a favor," she said when the line picked up. The woman on the other end of the line didn't say what kind of favor, or are you okay, or where are you. She'd known Vivian for 22 years, which was long enough to skip the questions. "Tell me what you need," she said. "I need a location that's clean, out of the city, and accessible within 4 hours. And I need it not to exist on paper in any way that connects to you or to me." A pause. Not a hesitation. The woman was not a person who hesitated. It was the pause of someone running through the available options with efficiency. "My cousin has a lake house in Warwick County," she said. "He won't be there until July. I have a key. He doesn't know you exist. That works? I'll text you the address from a different phone. Give me 10 minutes. "Thank you," Vivian said. "Vivian," her name said with a particular weight. "I know," Vivian said. "I'll tell you everything when it's over." She drove toward Warwick County in the rain. She drove with the radio off and the windows up, and her mind running through everything she knew about Damien's network, about Matteo's current vulnerabilities, about the sequence of events that was now, regardless of what she did or didn't do, going to unfold. The ledger she'd left on the coffee table was evidence of Damien's betrayal. It was damning, but incomplete. It showed the financial architecture of his parallel structure without connecting it explicitly to the 3 people who died or disappeared. The files on her laptop made that connection. She had not decided yet what to do with those files. She had not decided, and she was not going to decide under pressure, because pressure was exactly the condition under which smart people made catastrophic mistakes. And she had spent too long building this carefully to destroy it by moving too quickly now. She thought about Matteo. She thought about the fear on his face. She thought about 41 floors of elevator in 60 seconds in a parking garage with her hands on the wheel and the specific physical weight of the decision she'd already made. She was not going back. But she was not done either. The rain kept coming. The road kept moving. Somewhere behind her, 2 separate operations, one run by her husband, one run by the man who intended to replace him, were beginning to converge on the same target. Her. She gripped the wheel and drove harder into the dark. The lake house in Warwick County was 4 hours away. She had a great deal to figure out before she got there, and the first thing she had to figure out was whether the files on her laptop were the only thing keeping her alive, or whether they were the thing most likely to get her killed. She was still deciding when the headlights appeared in her rear-view mirror. 3 cars back. Dark SUV. It had been there for 40 minutes. Her hands tightened on the wheel. She kept her speed exactly where it was, and she thought about the second phone in her bag, the one she'd purchased specifically for this moment, the one that connected to a number she'd memorized and never dialed. She reached for it. She didn't dial immediately. That was the first thing, the discipline of not reacting, which she'd learned not from Matteo, but from the years of watching what happened to people around Matteo who reacted before they thought. The SUV was 3 cars back. It had been there for 40 minutes. That meant either it had picked her up leaving the town with the hardware store, or it had been waiting somewhere along this stretch of highway and fallen in behind her without her noticing the attachment. She needed to know which. She took the next exit. Not urgently. She drifted into the exit lane with the casual signal of someone who'd planned to turn off here all along, and she came down the ramp at a normal speed, and she watched the rearview mirror. The SUV stayed on the highway. She let out a breath she hadn't fully registered holding. She sat at the bottom of the ramp for a moment, engine idling, watching the tail end of the highway traffic slide past the gap where the exit opened. No dark SUV peeling off to follow. No second vehicle she recognized coming off behind her. Just headlights going past in the rain. She'd been wrong. Or it hadn't been following her. Or it had been following her and its driver had made the calculation that staying with her through an unexpected exit was too obvious a tell. All three possibilities were equally concerning, which meant she couldn't safely interpret the result either way. She pulled out her phone and looked at the message that had come in 11 minutes ago from the secondary number her contact had used. An address in Warwick County. A gate code. A note that said, "Key under the ceramic frog by the back door. Don't ask. My cousin is like that." She typed back, "Tail possible. Maybe late." The response came in under a minute. Understood. Be careful. 2 words. Vivian had always loved that about her. The economy of it. No spiral into alarm, no questions that would slow things down. Just the acknowledgement and the instruction, both of which were useful. She got back on the highway via the on-ramp and drove. She arrived at the lake house at 11:47 in the morning. The rain had slowed to the kind of persistent gray drizzle that wasn't dramatic enough to call a storm and wasn't light enough to ignore. The lake house sat back from the road behind a stand of pine trees that had probably been planted by whoever built the place 50 years ago, when the concept of privacy was handled by trees and distance rather than digital architecture. The driveway was gravel. The gate was a simple wooden affair that opened manually. Vivian parked the car behind the house where it couldn't be seen from the road, retrieved the key from under the ceramic frog, which was, she noted, a very ugly frog, the kind of aggressively unappealing object that could only be the result of a genuine aesthetic commitment or a gift from someone you loved too much to discard, and let herself in. The house smelled like pine and old upholstery and the particular closed-up smell of a building that hadn't been inhabited in months. She moved through it quickly, checking the windows, confirming the layout. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a main room with a stone fireplace, and a kitchen separated from it by a counter rather than a wall. Back door onto a deck that faced the lake. Front windows with a partial view of the driveway. Functional. Clean. Isolated. Good. She sat up at the kitchen table with the laptop open and a glass of water she didn't drink, and spent the next 2 hours going through everything she knew about Damien Vale's secondary network with the specific intention of identifying how he had known about the ledger and how quickly and through what channel. The answer, when she found it, was simple and ugly. Matteo had told him. Not deliberately, not with any awareness of what he was doing, but Matteo, and this was the thing about Matteo that she had tried to tell him, that she had tried to explain in a dozen different ways across 6 years of marriage. Matteo had a habit of thinking out loud with the people he trusted most when he was rattled, and Damien Vale had been the person he trusted most. And when Vivian walked out at 10:15 the previous night, Matteo had apparently called Damien by 11. She found the evidence of the call in the secondary files, a record of a contact that Damien's network had flagged and logged as relevant. Matteo's direct line to Damien's personal cell, lasting 14 minutes, time-stamped at 11:08 p.m. 14 minutes. Long enough for Matteo to tell Damien that Vivian had left. Long enough to describe the ledger. Long enough for Damien to understand exactly what had happened and to activate his people before Matteo had even begun to process the full scope of the betrayal the ledger documented. Vivian sat back in the kitchen chair and pressed her fingers against the bridge of her nose. She was not angry. Anger required a kind of surprise as its fuel, and she wasn't surprised. She had known, on some level, that this was how it would go. That the primary vulnerability in her plan was not her own exposure, but Matteo's instinct to reach for Damien when things went wrong. She'd known it, and she'd built the ledger and walked out anyway because there was no version of this that was safe, and the question was never, can I eliminate the risk, but can I survive it? She picked up the phone. She called Carla. He told Damien, she said without preamble. A pause on the other end. How soon after you left? 11 o'clock. Less than an hour. God! Carla said it flat, like a period rather than an exclamation. Does Matteo know that he… No. He doesn't know about the surveillance on the penthouse. He doesn't know Damien has been logging his calls. He doesn't know that a 14-minute phone call at 11 p.m. is now the reason his people and Damien's people are both looking for me simultaneously. He will when he figures out the ledger. He's had the ledger for 12 hours. He's a smart man. She paused. He'll figure it out. And when he does? Vivian looked at the lake through the back window. The water was gray and flat, and the rain was dimpling its surface in 1,000 small circles that opened and closed so fast they were almost invisible. When he does, she said, Damien becomes the most dangerous person in the situation. Because right now, Damien still thinks Matteo might be manageable. The moment Matteo understands what Damien has built, fully understands it, not just the financial architecture, but the surveillance, the contractors, the 3 people, Damien will know Matteo is coming for him. And Damien will move first. He'll move first, Vivian confirmed, which means we have maybe 36 hours before this goes from a search into something much worse. Another pause. Longer. She could hear Carla breathing, the specific quality of breath that characterized a smart person working through the implications of something. What do you need? Carla said. Right now? I need you to find out where Matteo is and whether he started reviewing the ledger in detail. I can do that. What else? Vivian looked at the laptop screen, at the folder labeled with a single word, contractors. I need to know if Damien has moved any of his people into active positions in the last 12 hours. That's harder. I know. I'll try. Carla paused. Vivian, are you actually safe where you are? Vivian thought about the drive here, the SUV 3 cars back that had stayed on the highway, the gravel driveway she could hear from anywhere in this small house, the ceramic frog by the back door. For now, she said. Carla called back at 2:15. Matteo is at the secondary office on Vandermeer Street. He's been there since 6 this morning with 6 of his core people, and he has the ledger. He's had his financial analyst going through it since 9. Which analyst? Pruitt. Vivian absorbed that. Pruitt was good, methodical, careful, and entirely loyal to Matteo rather than to the organization in the abstract. He would work through the ledger systematically, and he would find everything in it, and he would present it to Matteo in terms that were clear and unambiguous. How long before Pruitt gets through it? At the pace they're apparently working, 4, 5 hours. Maybe less. Okay, she did the math. 7 p.m., 8 p.m. What about Damien's people? This is where it gets complicated. Carla's voice tightened slightly. I reached out to a contact in the city zoning office. Don't ask, it's a long story. Who has visibility into property activity in the Eastern Corridor? 3 of Damien's shell properties have had significant foot traffic in the last 10 hours. Active foot traffic. People going in and out at irregular hours. Staging. That's what it looks like. Vivian stood up from the table and moved to the front window. She looked at the driveway. Empty. Trees, rain. Carla, is there anything in the last 12 hours that looks like active surveillance or tracking rather than staging? A breath. Yes. One thing. There's a vehicle registered to a company I recognize from one of your earlier files, one of Damien's secondary shells, that was ticketed in the parking lot of a rest stop on Highway 7 at 6 this morning. Highway 7. The rest stop she'd passed through. How long was it parked there? The ticket was issued at 6:02, which means it was there before 6. She'd stopped at that rest area at approximately 5:40 in the morning. They were already tracking the route, Vivian said. Her voice was very quiet. It looks that way. Carla paused. How did they know which route? The car I left at the first safe house. They got to it faster than I expected. She moved away from the window. The second car should still be clean, but if they had someone at the rest stop and I didn't pick them up. You made it to where you are without being followed? I believe so, but I also believe the first safe house was solid, so… She pressed her palm flat against the kitchen counter and looked at the back door, the lake beyond it, the gray water. You need to move again, Carla said. Not yet. Moving in daylight increases exposure. I need to think about this. She paused. I need Matteo to move faster. What? Matteo needs to see the full picture before tonight. If he's still working through the financial records, he's not seeing the operational structure. He's not seeing the three names. She made a decision that she'd been circling for hours without committing to. I need you to send him something. Send him what? There's a file. I'm going to email it to you from a secure address in the next 10 minutes. I need you to print it and hand deliver it to the office on Vandermeer. Don't send it digitally. Don't describe it over the phone. Let's just put it in his hands. What does the file contain? The names, Vivian said, and the evidence connecting them to Damien. Silence. Vivian. Carla's voice had something in it that hadn't been there before. If Matteo sees those names, he'll stop trying to assess the financial damage and start understanding that Damien has been removing people. Yes. He'll be... She stopped. He's going to go after Damien. I know. Immediately. I know, Carla. That's going to accelerate everything. If Damien's people are staging and Matteo goes at Damien directly, I know what it does, Vivian said. I've thought about it. Another silence. Longer. The sound of rain through the phone, or maybe just through the window. She couldn't tell which side it was coming from. You're using Matteo, Carla said. Not accusatory, just identifying. Vivian didn't answer right away. I'm giving Matteo information he needs, she said finally. What he does with it is his decision. That's a careful way of saying yes. It's an accurate way of saying it's complicated. She moved back to the laptop. Carla, do this for me. Print the file and take it to Vandermeer. Tell Matteo it came from me and that I'm okay and that I'll be in contact when I can. A pause. Tell him that last part yourself, Carla said quietly. Call him. She sat with that for 4 minutes. 4 minutes during which she opened the file, reviewed it, confirmed it, said what she needed it to say, and sent it to Carla's secure email. During which she also thought about Carla's instruction, call him yourself, and the specific quality of the silence on the phone line when Carla had said it, which was the silence of someone who wasn't overstepping, but was also refusing to pretend she didn't see what was actually happening. Vivian knew what Carla saw. Carla saw two people, Matteo and Vivian, doing what damaged people do when they're caught between what they feel and what they've decided, which was to route everything through intermediaries and paperwork and the cold logistics of survival, so they didn't have to do the harder thing, which was to speak directly. She picked up the main phone. She dialed Matteo. He answered on the second ring. Where are you? His voice was rough. She could hear background noise, multiple voices, papers, the ambient static of a room full of people working urgently on something. I'm safe, she said. That's all you need to know right now. That's not... He stopped. She heard him move, presumably away from the other people in the room. The background noise receded. Vivian, I have people looking for you in 4 different directions and I don't have a single solid lead, and someone accessed the parking camera at your first location and wiped the footage, which means you're being tracked by someone who is not operating like a civilian, and I need to know where you are. You need to know about the file I'm sending you. What file? Carla is bringing it. It will be there within the hour. Matteo. She stopped. Restarted. The ledger is the financial structure. The file is the operational history. It's not the same thing. A pause. How operational? He said, and his voice had changed. Lower. Careful in a way that was different from careful because he was in a meeting. Careful the way a man gets careful when he already suspects what's coming. 3 names, she said. People who were in a position to see what Damien was building in the last 18 months. She heard his breath. Vivian, Harrigan, Dell, and Marcus Chen. The silence that came after Marcus Chen's name had a different character from any other silence in the conversation. Marcus Chen had been in Matteo's organization for 12 years. He'd been more than an employee. Vivian knew that, had always known it, because of the particular way Matteo spoke about him, which was rarely and with the specific weight of someone who meant more than the words were carrying. Marcus had disappeared 7 months ago. The official understanding within the organization was that he'd walked away, relocated, chosen out. Matteo had never fully believed it. Now he knew why. How long have you known about Marcus? He said. 5 months. 5... His voice cracked on it, just barely. Just once. Then control came back down over it like a curtain. You knew for 5 months and you didn't. I didn't tell you because I didn't have the full evidentiary chain yet. I didn't have Damien connected to it with enough certainty to present it. I needed more time. He was my... He stopped. You should have told me. I know. Regardless of the chain, you should have... I know, Matteo. The line was quiet for a long time. Carla's bringing the file, Vivian said. Everything is documented. It's clean. It'll hold up to scrutiny. But when you look at it, I need you to understand something. What? Damien knows I took the ledger. He knew within an hour of my leaving because you called him, and he's had surveillance on the penthouse for over a year, and he's been logging your calls. She let that land. Let him work through the geometry of it. He's staging people. He's been moving assets for the last 10 hours. He's not waiting to see what you do. He's already moving. Yes. And he wants the file. He wants to contain what I know. The ledger was damaging. The file is fatal. Another pause. She could almost hear him thinking. The particular quality of Matteo thinking, which was dense and fast and arrived at conclusions without always showing its work. You're somewhere he can't reach, he said. Not a question. For now. For how long? She looked at the gray lake, the dimpled rain, the pine trees along the bank that were starting to move in a wind she hadn't noticed picking up. I don't know, she said honestly. I'm going to find you, he said, and his voice had gone very quiet, which was the version of his voice that meant he wasn't making a threat or a promise. He was just stating what was going to happen. Not to bring you back, not to take anything from you. I need you somewhere that is actually secure, and whatever you've arranged for yourself right now isn't that. You don't know what I've arranged. I know Damien had someone at the Highway 7 rest stop at 6 this morning. She went still. How do you know that? She said. Because I've been reviewing the surveillance records on that corridor since 7 a.m., and one of my people flagged a vehicle registered to a company name I recognized from the ledger. A pause. Your first safe house was compromised before you left it, Vivian. Whatever car you took from there, they had eyes on the route. I switched vehicles. I know. I found the first car. A pause. The second car. I don't have it yet. Which means Damien doesn't have it yet either. But that's time, not safety. She didn't say anything. Read me the gate code, he said. What? Wherever you are. There's a gate, or a door code, or a mile marker. Something. Give it to me. I'll send 2 people. No one Damien knows. No one who's been on active rotation in the last 18 months, and they will get you somewhere that is actually Matteo. Defended and Matteo. Her voice came out harder than she intended. Stop. He stopped. I'm not a package, she said. I'm not something you move from one secure location to another. I understand what's happening, and I have been managing it for 4 months. And the reason I'm still alive and still uncaptured is because I've been making good decisions. You don't get to take that over now because you're frightened. I'm not... He stopped. I'm not trying to take it over. You are. You're doing exactly what you always do. You identify a threat, and you immediately route everything through your own operational structure because that's the only way you know how to respond. But I am not a problem inside your operational structure. I'm outside it, and that's the only reason I'm still... She stopped, swallowed. I need you to work the Damien problem from your end. Let me work it from mine. A very long silence. You have a plan, he said slowly. I have the beginning of one. You're not going to tell me what it is. Not until it's further along. She heard him breathe, the long, controlled exhale of a man, accepting something he didn't fully accept. The file, he said. When Carla brings it, read the operational section first, not the financial records, the operational section, pages 14 through 31. She paused. And Matteo, when you read it, when you understand the full scope of what Damien has been building, I need you to be precise, not fast, precise. Because if you move on him too hard, too fast, I know how to move on someone. I know you do. That's not what I'm saying. She chose the next words carefully. Damien has a contingency. He's too careful not to. If you come at him directly and he triggers it, people get hurt who don't deserve to be hurt. I have the information that can prevent that, but only if you give me time to get it to the right place. What information? The names of the people inside your organization who are on his payroll. She let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. There are 6 of them. 2 of them are in the room with you right now. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she'd heard all day. She could hear it, the shift in his breathing, the almost inaudible sound of a man recalibrating his entire understanding of the room he was standing in, looking at the faces around him with new and entirely unwelcome information. "How do you know?" he said. His voice was almost inhumanly flat. "Because I spent 4 months documenting it." She held the phone steady. "Give me until tonight. Don't move on Damien before tonight. Work through the file with people you trust. And I mean actually trust, not people who have been with you for years, because length of service is one of the ways Damien selects. Work with Pruitt. Work with Harlan. Harlan. Harlan is clean. I verified it." She paused. "He's also the only person in your building who looked at me like he was actually worried about me rather than worried about what I might do. I noticed." Another silence. Different texture than the others. Softer, almost, around the edges. "You've been paying very close attention," Matteo said quietly. "For 6 years," she said. "You just didn't notice." She ended the call. She sat still for a while after that. The wind was moving the pine trees now, with enough force that she could hear them from inside the house. A low, continuous sound like something being dragged slowly across a hard floor. The lake was no longer flat. The rain had picked up again. Not the dramatic hammering of the previous night, but the steady, relentless kind that doesn't announce itself and doesn't let up. She drank the water she hadn't drunk earlier. She went through the remaining files on the laptop with the specific focus of someone who has a finite window and knows it. The 6 names she'd mentioned to Matteo, she cross-referenced each of them one more time against the documentary evidence, making certain the chain was clean, making certain there were no ambiguities that a skilled attorney could exploit. She was not going to provide Matteo with information that collapsed under pressure. She'd built this for 4 months, and she was going to hand it to him in a form that held. She was on the 4th name when the gravel driveway made a sound. Not a car. A single footstep. The specific crunch of gravel under a boot, slow and deliberate. The footstep of someone who was not hurrying and was not attempting to be quiet. She closed the laptop. She stood very still. The footstep came again. And again, moving toward the front of the house with the unhurried confidence of someone who had already confirmed the target was inside. She had 2 exits, front door and back door. The front was now compromised. The back opened onto the deck and then a short embankment to the water's edge. Beyond the water, the far shore was visible but distant. She picked up the secondary phone. She moved toward the back door, keeping her steps off the floorboards she'd already identified as the loudest during her initial walkthrough of the house. She reached the back door. She put her hand on the handle. The front window exploded inward. Not glass. The wooden frame of the window, kicked in from outside with enough force to take it out of the wall entirely. Cold air and rain and pine smell flooded the room, and through the hole where the window had been stepped a man she'd never seen before. Large, moving with the specific economy of someone trained to enter spaces aggressively and contain what was inside them. Behind her, the back door burst open. She was trapped between them. The man from the window looked at her across the wrecked room and said, "Ms. Cross, Mr. Vale would like his ledger back." She looked at him. She looked at the man behind her. She thought about the phone in her hand. The second phone, the one she'd purchased specifically for one number she'd memorized and never dialed. She looked back at the man from the window. "Tell Damien," she said carefully, "that the ledger isn't the problem." Her thumb found the call button. She pressed it. The call connected on the first ring. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The number she dialed was a dead drop, a line that, when activated, triggered a location ping to the only person who had the corresponding receiver. No words required, just the connection itself, which lasted exactly 4 seconds before she cut it. 4 seconds was enough. The man from the window crossed the room in 3 strides. I was faster than he looked, which was the thing about large men that people consistently underestimated. The assumption that size traded against speed, when in reality, the men who'd built that kind of mass through actual use rather than vanity were often terrifyingly quick over short distances. He covered the room before she'd fully processed his movement, and he had her wrist, the hand with the phone, in a grip that felt less like a hand and more like a door closing. She didn't fight it. That was the second thing. The discipline of not fighting a losing position. She let him take the phone. She kept her breathing even. She looked at him directly, which was something she'd learned made people slightly uncertain, because most people being grabbed expected fear, and fear looked a certain way, and what she was showing him wasn't that. "The laptop," he said. "Kitchen table." He looked at the man behind her, a shorter, harder-looking man who moved like someone who'd grown up in situations that required economy of motion, and something passed between them in the shorthand of people who'd worked together long enough to communicate without language. The second man went to the kitchen. She heard him pick up the laptop. The first man still had her wrist. He wasn't hurting her, deliberately, she thought, which told her something about the instructions he'd been given. Damien wanted her intact. Damien wanted her cooperative, or at minimum, functional. That was information. "Mr. Vale wants to speak with you," the man said. "I gathered. There's a car outside." "I assumed." He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a professional who has been sent to collect someone who isn't behaving according to the expected script. She watched him recalibrate, watched the small adjustment behind his eyes that meant he'd updated his assessment of what kind of problem she was. "Ms. Cross," he said, "this goes easier if you—" "I'm not going to run," she said. "I'm not going to fight you. I'm going to get in the car because I need to have the conversation with Damien as much as he needs to have it with me." She paused. "But I want you to understand that what you took from that table is not the thing that matters. The thing that matters is already somewhere Damien can't reach." The man said nothing. She let him walk her to the car. The drive took 40 minutes. She spent them in the back seat between the two men, watching the road through the rain-streaked window and cataloging what she knew about where they were heading based on the turns and the time and the quality of the road surface, which changed twice in ways that meant they'd crossed county lines. She also spent them thinking about the phone call. 4 seconds. Location ping. The person on the other end of the dead drop had the receiver and knew, as of 4 seconds of connection, that the ping had activated. They also knew, because she'd told them when she set the arrangement up, sitting in a coffee shop 7 months ago and explaining the contingency with the specificity of someone who hoped never to use it, what the ping meant. It meant, "I've been taken. Here is where I am. Give me 6 hours before you do anything, because I need 6 hours to do what I need to do, and if you move too fast, you'll collapse the window." The person on the other end was the only one besides Carla. She trusted with something this specific, and she trusted this person precisely because he had no connection to Matteo's world, no connection to Damien's world, and a very particular set of professional skills that she'd spent 2 months cultivating a friendship with before deciding he was actually a person she liked, rather than just a person who was useful. His name was Reyes. He worked in federal financial crimes. She had never told Matteo he existed. 6 hours. She had 6 hours to get what she needed from Damien before Reyes moved. The car stopped. It was a warehouse. Not the abandoned cinematic kind. This was a functioning light industrial building in what looked like an outer commercial district, the kind of place that processed or stored something legitimate during business hours, and which was, at 12:30 in the afternoon on a gray Wednesday, almost entirely deserted on the surrounding streets. Plausible. Practical. The kind of location a careful man used because it was harder to notice than a parking garage or a private residence. She filed all of it. They took her through a side entrance, down a corridor that smelled like machine oil and cold concrete, and into a room that had been, at some point, an office. It still had the bones of one. The framing where the cubicle walls had been removed, a window with frosted glass that faced an interior space she couldn't see into. 3 folding chairs. A table. A space heater in the corner that was making the room's temperature uneven, warm near the heater and cold at the edges. Damien was already there. She had not seen him in 8 weeks since the dinner at Matteo's favored restaurant. He looked the same, which she'd half expected. Damien Vale was the kind of man who maintained a consistent surface across a wide range of circumstances, whose practiced warmth sat on him like a second skin that was so well fitted you almost stopped noticing it was a costume. Almost. He was standing with his hands in his pockets, in a gray suit that was slightly less formal than what he usually wore, and he looked at her when she came in with an expression she could only describe as measured. "Vivian," he said, "I'm sorry about the window." She looked at him. "No, you're not," she said. He almost smiled. "No," he agreed. "I'm not." He gestured to one of the chairs. "Sit down. I'll stand. He looked at the two men who'd brought her in. Something in the look dismissed them. Not entirely. They stayed in the room, but they moved back and to the sides in a way that was meant to communicate that this was now a conversation rather than a detention. Damien pulled out one of the chairs and sat in it himself, which was the kind of move designed to make the standing person feel slightly awkward and create a low-grade pressure to mirror the seated posture. She'd seen Matteo use it in negotiations. She stayed where she was. "You've been busy," Damien said. "Yes. 4 months." He tilted his head slightly. "I've been going back through the last 4 months trying to identify the moments you were operating, and I keep finding them, which is, honestly, Vivian, impressive. You are very good at being invisible when you want to be. I learned from watching people around Matteo, including me, especially you." He absorbed that without any visible reaction. "The ledger. What about it?" "You left it on the coffee table." "I did." "That was intentional." "Everything I do is intentional." He looked at her for a moment. Not with hostility. That was the thing about Damien that was most disturbing, she thought. He looked at her with something that resembled genuine interest, the way a scientist looks at a specimen that's behaving in an unexpectedly sophisticated way. "The ledger is damaging," he said. "But you knew that when you built it, which means you also knew it wasn't sufficient. The financial architecture alone, without the operational chain, doesn't constitute the kind of evidence that ends careers. It raises questions, but questions can be managed." He paused. "What's on the laptop is different." "The laptop your man took from my kitchen table." "Yes." She said nothing. "Vivian." His voice shifted slightly. Warmer. Deliberately warmer. "I'm not your enemy. I know that's difficult to accept right now in these circumstances, but I want you to think carefully about what you actually know about me versus what you've constructed from incomplete information. The information isn't incomplete. All information is incomplete. That's the nature of Harrison Kell," she said. "Died November 14th. Ruled accidental." Kell had been auditing the property records in the Eastern Corridor for 8 months before his death, and had flagged 3 transactions connected to Whitmore Holdings, which is 2 shells removed from a company whose board membership includes a name that appears in your personal financial records. She kept her voice flat. Sandra Dell. Disappeared March 2nd. Dell was coordinating logistics across 3 of Matteo's territories, and had noticed irregular routing of materials through a depot that your people were using for secondary movement. She raised it internally. She was gone 11 days later. She took a breath. Marcus Chen. Damien's expression didn't change. "Marcus was Matteo's," she said. 12 years. He was also specifically brilliant at identifying structural anomalies in complex organizations, which is why Matteo valued him, and which is why, when Marcus started noticing things he shouldn't have noticed, you couldn't manage him the way you managed the others. Silence. "You couldn't buy him," she said. "You couldn't frighten him. You couldn't discredit him because his reputation inside the organization was too solid. So he disappeared." She looked at Damien steadily. "I know where." Something moved in Damien's face. The first thing that had moved in it since she'd come into the room. Not guilt. She didn't think Damien Vale experienced guilt in any form she'd recognize, but calculation. A rapid, visible calculation. "You know where Marcus Chen is," he said. "I know where his body is. Yes." The room was very quiet for a moment. Then Damien did something she hadn't expected. He laughed. Not loudly, not long, but genuinely. A short exhale of actual amusement that was worse, somehow, than anger would have been. "You've been building a murder case," he said. "I've been building a complete record. Against me, specifically. Against the operational history of a man who has been systematically removing anyone capable of exposing what he's built." "Yes." He leaned back in the chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at her. The calculated warmth had receded, and what was underneath it was something she couldn't name. Not cold exactly. More like the temperature of something that had been cold for so long it had stopped being a quality and become just the thing itself. "The laptop is encrypted," he said. "Yes." "My people are working on it." "They won't get through it. They're very good." "The encryption key is biometric," she said. "Specifically, a sequence that requires my right thumb in the correct order at the correct pressure. Without me, the drive wipes after 3 failed attempts. She paused. Did they already try? The slight compression of his mouth told her they had. 1 attempt remaining, she said, before everything on it is gone. Damien looked at her right hand. I'm not going to hurt you, he said. I know. You need me cooperative. She let that sit. Which is why we're talking, which is exactly what I wanted. The calculation behind his eyes shifted again, and she watched him arrive at the same place she'd been for the last 40 minutes in the car. The understanding that this woman had not been caught. She had been present. The distinction mattered enormously, and he was only now fully processing it. What do you want, Vivian? He said. The same thing I've always wanted, she said. To not be in danger. You're not in danger. Harrison Kell thought that too. His jaw tightened slightly. Kell was a complication. He was a person. In this business, those are sometimes the same thing. She looked at him. And that, she said quietly, is why I built the ledger. He gave her water. It was a small thing and probably tactical. Giving someone something, even something insignificant, shifted the dynamic in a subtle way that experienced negotiators used deliberately. She accepted it because refusing it would have been its own kind of performance, and she was tired of performing. She drank half the bottle and set it on the table and thought about the 6 hours. 3 hours and 40 minutes remaining. Damien had stepped out of the room briefly. The 2 men remained, the large one from the window standing near the door, the smaller one near the table, both of them operating in the specific register of professional patience that meant they'd done this before and they knew how to wait. She was thinking about the conversation that had just happened when the door opened again and Damien came back in. He was carrying the laptop. He set it on the table in front of her. I'm going to offer you something, he said. He sat down again, closer this time, the chair angled so the distance between them was conversational rather than interrogative. I want you to hear it fully before you respond. She looked at the laptop on the table. I'm listening, she said. The records you've built, the ledger, the files, the operational history, constitute, as you clearly know, a significant threat. To me, and collaterally to Matteo's operation, which I think you understand is also a threat to Matteo personally. He folded his hands. I'm proposing that we reach an arrangement, one that gets you out of the city, genuinely out, with resources, with a clean identity and sufficient means to start completely fresh anywhere you choose. In exchange for the laptop and confirmation that no additional copies of the files exist in external locations. She looked at him. You want me to disappear, she said. I want you to be safe, he said, and I want this to be finished cleanly. Without Matteo knowing what you did to Marcus. Without anyone knowing what it cost to get here, which protects you as much as it protects me, Vivian. You've been inside this world for 6 years. You know things that could be interpreted in ways that wouldn't be comfortable for you either. She understood the implication. It wasn't a threat exactly. It was a shape of a threat, the outline of one, placed on the table for her to contemplate. She looked at the laptop. She thought about Reyes. 3 hours, 20 minutes. She thought about Matteo in the office on Vandermeer Street, working through the file Carla had delivered, reading pages 14 through 31. She thought about Marcus Chen, who had been with Matteo for 12 years, and who had been brilliant and incapable of looking away from things he noticed, and who was now somewhere she knew about, and Damien knew she knew about. She thought about what it would mean to take Damien's offer. Clean identity, resources, genuinely free of all of it. The marriage, the empire, the 4 months of meticulous, terrible work she'd done in the margins of a life that had slowly eaten her. She could take it. She sat with that honestly, because she owed herself that much. The honest acknowledgement that the offer was real and the freedom it described was real and part of her. The part that had stood at the window watching the rain 3 days ago, thinking about disappearing inside a marriage like a street inside a flood, wanted it with a physical urgency that surprised her. Then she thought about Marcus Chen again. No, she said. Damien exhaled through his nose. Not anger. Resignation that had expected this answer. Vivian, I'm not going to disappear and let you continue. I'm not going to take your money and your clean identity and spend whatever's left of my life knowing that Harrison Kell and Sandra Dell and Marcus Chen are explanations I decline to give. She looked at him directly. That's not who I am. Then who are you? He said. And for the first time, the practiced warmth was entirely gone, and what was underneath it was something she'd been waiting to see. The actual face, the unperformed version, and it was not monstrous. It was just cold and utterly practical in a way that was worse than monstrous, because it was human, and it had made its calculations, and it had decided that the results were acceptable. "I'm the person who built the ledger," she said. "That's who I am now." Damien stood up. He looked at her for a long moment, then he said, "Open the laptop." "No." "Vivian." His voice had flattened completely. "I've tried to make this simple. I've tried to make it survivable for you, but you are making a choice right now that—" The door opened. Not the two men. They were already in the room. This was a third person, entering from the corridor, and she turned toward the sound reflexively and then went completely still. It was Carla. Carla Sims, Matteo, who was supposed to be hand-delivering a file to the office on Vandermeer Street, stood in the doorway of a warehouse room in an outer commercial district with her coat wet from the rain and an expression on her face that Vivian had never seen there before. Vivian looked at Carla. Carla looked at Vivian. And Vivian understood, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, with the specific, shattering clarity of a person watching the architecture of everything they've built collapse from the foundation, that the file had never gone to Vandermeer Street. Carla had brought it here. "I'm sorry," Carla said. The words came out genuine, which was almost worse than if they'd been calculated. Vivian could hear it, the actual regret in Carla's voice, layered over something older and harder that had been there underneath for a long time. "How long?" Vivian said. Carla looked at the floor briefly, then back up. 3 years. Damien. Yes. Vivian's mind was running very fast and very cold. 3 years. Carla had been feeding Damien information for 3 years, which meant she was running it backward, running through every conversation she'd had with Carla, every time she'd called her, everything she'd said in the last 24 hours, the route she'd taken out of the city, the secondary car, the name of the rest stop, which she'd mentioned when Carla told her about the ticketed vehicle, the lake house. The lake house. Carla had given her the lake house address. Carla had known exactly where she was. "The tail on the highway," Vivian said. Her voice was very quiet. "It didn't pick me up from the safe house." "No," Carla said. "It was already waiting." "Yes." "Because you knew the route before I drove it." She looked at Carla steadily. "Because I told you I was heading toward Warwick County." "Yes." She did not move. She was standing in the middle of the room between the folding chairs and the table with the laptop on it. And she did not move because moving felt impossible in the same way that breathing feels impossible right after something hits you very hard in the chest. The mechanics are still available, but the body needs a moment to remember how to run them. Carla had been the one person she'd told everything. The route, the second car, the lake house, the content of the call with Matteo, the file she'd sent, the file with the 6 names of Damien's people inside Matteo's organization. Damien had the names. He'd had them for hours. Those 6 people were already moved or hidden or repositioned, the evidence chain compromised or insulated, the window she'd described to Matteo, the window she'd said required precision over speed, already closed. She had given Damien everything he needed to survive the exposure of his operation, and she had done it willingly, in the belief that she was operating with a trustworthy ally. Damien crossed the room. He picked up the laptop from the table. "Open it," he said quietly. "Last time." She looked at him. She looked at Carla, who had the expression of a person who has made a decision they can't unmake and has decided to stand in it rather than look away from it, which was a kind of courage Vivian thought was completely indistinguishable from cowardice in this particular light. She looked at the large man near the door. She thought about Reyes, 2 hours 50 minutes, and then she thought about something she hadn't let herself think about yet because she'd been so focused on the plan, on the 6 hours, on the operational precision that she'd built this entire situation around. She thought about the 6 names she'd given Matteo, and about whether Matteo, upon receiving the file and reading pages 14 through 31, had done the things she'd told him not to do. The things she'd specifically said, "Don't move on Damien before tonight. Be precise, not fast." She thought about Matteo Rourke, who was a man of many qualities, and precision was among them, but who had just read the name Marcus Chen in a document that confirmed his worst fear about what had happened to someone who had mattered to him. She thought about what a man like that did when he read a document like that. Her phone, the main phone, which Damien's man had taken, buzzed in the large man's jacket pocket. Everyone in the room heard it. Damien looked at the large man. "Check it," Damien said. The man pulled out the phone. He looked at the screen. He looked at Damien. "It's a text," he said. "From her husband." Damien held out his hand. The man gave him the phone. Damien read it. She watched his face as he read it, and she watched the moment the practiced surface of him cracked. Not broke, not shattered, but cracked. The way good ceramic cracks. A single fracture line that runs fast from one edge to the other and changes the structural integrity of everything. He looked up at her. "He's at the Vandermeer office," Damien said. His voice had lost its evenness. He stopped. "What does it say?" Vivian said. Damien turned the phone around. She read it. 4 words. "I know where you are." And then a second message sent 30 seconds later from the same number. "Both of you." The room went very loud without anyone speaking. Because Matteo knowing where Damien was meant that the 6 names she'd given Carla, the 6 names Carla had delivered to Damien, included someone who had also, in the last several hours, told Matteo where Damien ran his operations when he wasn't using his listed addresses. Double agent. Someone in Damien's network was feeding Matteo, which meant the file Carla had redirected here had also gone to Vandermeer, because the person feeding Matteo had seen it arrive and had gotten the contents to him through a channel Carla didn't know about. Matteo had the names, and Matteo had known where Damien was for long enough to be already moving. Damien dropped the phone on the table. He looked at the large man. He looked at the man near the kitchen. Something passed between the 3 of them that was not language. Vivian picked up the phone from the table. No one stopped her. She looked at the messages from Matteo's number. She looked at the timestamp on the second one. 12 minutes ago. She looked at Damien, who was moving toward the door now, and at Carla, who had gone the color of old chalk, and who was standing with her hands pressed flat against the sides of her coat, like she was trying to hold herself together through the fabric. Vivian made a decision. Not the decision she'd planned to make. Not the sequence she'd built. The plan was gone. Carla had collapsed it. Damien had the 6 names. The window she'd constructed was closed. She needed a different move entirely. She looked at the laptop on the table. The drive would wipe on the 3rd failed attempt. Damien's people had made one. She reached across the table and opened the laptop. Damien turned from the door. "Wait," he said sharply. She pressed her right thumb to the reader. Wrong thumb. The screen flashed a single error indicator. 2 failed attempts. 1 remaining. Damien crossed the room in 4 strides and grabbed her wrist. The same grip, door closing, and looked at her with something she'd never seen on a human face directed at her before, which was the specific desperation of a man watching something he cannot lose and cannot stop. "If that drive wipes, then you have nothing on me," she said. "No proof I knew what was in it. No evidence I was anything other than a woman who found some files she didn't understand and made copies because she was scared." She looked at him. Her wrist was in his grip, and she was not fighting it, and she was looking at him with the steadiest eyes she could produce. "You can't use what doesn't exist, Damien, and you can't use me if I'm not here." From outside the building, from the direction of the entrance they'd brought her through, the side door off the corridor, she heard something. A sound she recognized. The flat, percussive sound of a door being taken off its frame. Damien heard it too. His grip on her wrist went rigid. "Your husband," he said. "He's precise when he needs to be," she said. "I told you that." The second sound came from the other side of the building. The main entrance, she guessed, based on the different acoustic quality of it. 2 entry points simultaneously. She had 30 seconds, maybe less. She looked at Carla. Carla was looking at her with an expression that had moved past regret into something raw and more specific. The look of a person watching the last exit close. "Carla," Vivian said. Her voice was very clear. "When they come in, and they're coming in right now, you tell them everything. Do you understand me? Everything. Not just about Damien, about the routing, about the 3 names, about Marcus Chen." "Vivian." "Because if you don't," Vivian said, "I will walk out of this room, and I will give Reyes everything I have, and the federal case will name you specifically in the cover-up, and everything you did for 3 years will land on you without any of the protection Damien promised you." She paused. "Is that protection still real, Carla? Look at where he's standing." Carla looked. Damien was at the door. He had let go of Vivian's wrist. He was at the door and his hand was on the frame, and he was looking at the corridor with the focus of a man running calculations about whether the exit he needed was still available. He was not looking at Carla. He was not going to take Carla with him. 3 years. And he was not going to take her. Carla's breath came out in a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a word. Vivian picked up the laptop. She pressed her left thumb to the reader. Her actual thumb, the correct hand, the correct sequence, and the screen opened. She had 12 seconds before the first of Matteo's people came through the corridor door, which she could now hear approaching. The specific cadence of multiple people moving fast through a constrained space. She navigated to the folder labeled External Send, a folder she'd built for exactly this moment, containing a compressed package of every file on the drive, pre-addressed to a secure federal server through a protocol Reyes had helped her set up 7 months ago. She hit send. The progress bar started. The corridor door came off its hinges. Damien ran. He went out the main entrance. She heard it open, heard the shouting from outside that meant Matteo's people were there too. And then there was a sound she couldn't parse, a complicated sound of multiple bodies and a hard surface and something breaking, and then voices. Too many voices to separate, calling things she couldn't make out from inside the room. Vivian stood at the table. She watched the progress bar. 62%. 68. The large man from the window was gone, had gone with Damien, she thought, or through a third exit she hadn't known about. The smaller man was still in the room, standing near the far wall with his hands visible, which was the posture of a person who has made a rapid assessment of their situation and concluded that visible hands were the correct choice. 74%. Harlan came through the corridor. She recognized his silhouette before she recognized his face. The specific width of him, the way he moved, which was the way he always moved, like someone who had grown up in spaces that required him to be larger than comfortable and had made his peace with taking up room. He came through this door with 2 people she didn't recognize, and he saw her immediately, and he stopped. He looked at her. He looked at the laptop. 81%. "Harlan," she said. "Mrs. Rourke." His voice was the gravel ground to powder it always was. "Are you hurt?" "No." "The man who was here." "He went out the main entrance. Matteo's people were there." "I know." He was already moving into the room, checking the corners with the systematic efficiency of someone who'd done this kind enough times that it was muscle memory. "There's a car. I need 40 seconds, she said. He looked at the laptop. He looked at her. He nodded. 93%. Carla had sat down in one of the folding chairs. She was sitting with her hands in her lap and her head slightly bowed. And she was not crying, but she looked like someone who had recently moved past the point where crying was the relevant response and arrived somewhere quieter and more permanent. 97. 99. Transfer complete. Vivian closed the laptop. She looked at Harlan. "Where's Matteo?" she said. Harlan's expression shifted by approximately 2 degrees towards something she didn't have a name for. "He's outside," Harlan said. "He went after Vale personally." She picked up the laptop. She walked toward the corridor door. "Mrs. Rourke," Harlan said. She stopped. "Vale had a secondary team positioned outside. We didn't know until—" He stopped. The 2-degree shift in his expression became something she could read now, and what she read in it made the floor feel unreliable under her feet. "Until what?" she said. "Mr. Rourke engaged Vale's people at the exterior entrance," Harlan said. His voice was absolutely flat, which was the voice of a man delivering information that requires flatness to be delivered at all. There was an exchange. She was already moving before he finished the sentence. She went through the corridor at something between a walk and a run, through the side entrance and out into the cold, wet air of the afternoon. And she came around the corner of the building to the exterior main entrance where 3 of Matteo's vehicles were parked at angles that suggested rapid deployment rather than orderly arrival, and where 6 people were standing in various postures of aftermath, and where Matteo was sitting on the ground with his back against the building's exterior wall and his left hand pressed against his right side. She stopped. He looked up at her. His face was the color of old concrete, and he was breathing with the specific controlled shallowness of someone managing pain by keeping their ribcage as still as possible, and his eyes, when they found her, went through three things in very fast succession: relief, and something that was almost anger, and then just her, just Vivian, in a way that had no performance left in it. "You're here," he said. His voice was rougher than she'd ever heard it. She crossed the distance between them and went down to one knee beside him and looked at his hand against his side. And she looked at the dark stain spreading through the gray fabric of his shirt, and she put her hand over his without thinking about it, covering his fingers with hers, applying pressure. "I'm here," she said. He looked at her hand on top of his. "The laptop," he said. "Sent." "Damien, tell me later." She looked up at Harlan, who had come out behind her. "Call an ambulance." "Already called," Harlan said. She looked back at Matteo. I was looking at her with that expression, the one she'd named twice in her memory, the one that had appeared exactly twice before in 6 years, the fear face, the human face, the one that didn't have any of the empire in it. "I was precise," he said, and there was something almost plaintive in it, which was a quality she'd never heard in his voice before, and which did something to her chest that she wasn't prepared for. "You were fast," she said. "I was both. You got shot, Matteo." I was still precise. He exhaled carefully, managing the breath. "Damien is contained. My people have him. He didn't—" He stopped, managed another careful breath. "He didn't get out." She kept her hand over his. The afternoon was gray and cold around them. Rain had slowed to almost nothing, just the memory of rain, a kind of ambient moisture in the air that wasn't quite falling. Somewhere in the building behind them, Carla was sitting in a folding chair with her hands in her lap. Somewhere in the secured grip of Matteo's people, Damien Vale was being held in whatever posture defeat took on a man who had built 4 years of careful architecture toward a future that had just closed. And Vivian was kneeling on wet asphalt with her hand pressed over her husband's and her laptop under her arm, and the complete destruction of every plan she'd made in the last 24 hours sitting in her chest alongside something she hadn't planned for either. She looked at Matteo's face. He was looking at her like she was the only fixed point in the available geography. She thought, "I don't know what comes next." She thought, "Neither does he." She thought, "We are both, right now, people without a plan, which is the most honest we have been with each other in 6 years. Sirens started somewhere in the middle distance. She kept her hand exactly where it was and did not move and did not look away. The ambulance took 11 minutes. Vivian counted them the same way she'd counted the elevator floors the night she left. By necessity, because the mind needs something mechanical to hold on to when everything else is moving too fast and too wrong. She kept her hand over Matteo's and she counted, and she watched his face for the signs she'd learned to read in 6 years of watching him manage things that were supposed to be unmanageable. He was managing, but it was costing him. "Stop doing that," he said, at minute 4. "Doing what?" "Assessing me. You look like Pruitt when he's going through a balance sheet." "Pruitt doesn't kneel on wet asphalt." "No." A careful breath. "He'd ruin his trousers." She didn't smile. She wanted to, which surprised her, and she didn't, which was the right call, because smiling felt like something that belonged to a different version of the situation than the one they were actually in. His color was bad. Not catastrophic. She'd seen catastrophic, and this wasn't it, but bad enough that she kept the pressure steady and didn't let herself think about what was happening under her hand with any specificity. "The file went through," she said. "To Reyes." She went still. "You know about Reyes?" "I've known about Reyes for 4 months." His eyes were on the middle distance, which was how he looked when he was conserving, not zoning out, but deliberately narrowing the expenditure. "Federal financial crimes. You met him at the Harwick Symposium. You like him because he doesn't talk too much." "You had me watched." "I had the people around you watched. There's a difference." A pause. "I stopped 3 months ago. When I realized what you were building and that putting surveillance on you was exactly the kind of thing that would confirm everything you already thought about me." She absorbed that. "So you knew," she said. "I knew something. I didn't know the scope." He shifted, almost imperceptibly, and she felt the tension move through his arm into his hand under hers. "I didn't know about Marcus." She didn't say anything. "You should have told me about Marcus," he said. "I know." 4 months, Vivian." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. The sounds around them were the sounds of aftermath, Harlan directing the people who were with them, low voices, the distant urban ambient of a commercial district in the middle of a gray afternoon. She could hear a car idling somewhere she couldn't see. "Why didn't you?" he said. She looked at his profile, the concrete color of his skin, the careful management of his breathing. "Because telling you meant trusting you," she said. "And I didn't know if I still did." He turned his head and looked at her, just looked at her, with his hand under hers and the dark stain spreading at a rate she was choosing not to calculate. "Fair," he said. The ambulance came around the corner. But they would not let her ride with him. She understood the logic, and she argued against it anyway, briefly, in the specific register of a person who knows the argument won't work and is making it for reasons that have nothing to do with winning. The paramedics were professional and unmovable, and Harlan put his hand on her shoulder, not restraining, just present, and she stopped. She watched the ambulance leave. Then she turned to Harlan. "Damien," she said, "secured. Matteo's people have him in the secondary vehicle." Harlan nodded toward the furthest of the three cars at bad angles. "We're waiting on instruction." "The instruction is that nothing happens to him before the federal hold is established." She had the phone in her hand, the secondary phone, the one with Reyes's number, and she was already dialing. "If Damien Vale is touched before he's in federal custody, every piece of evidence I just transmitted becomes weaponizable by his defense. Do you understand that?" "Yes." "Tell Matteo's people." "Matteo's people," Harlan said carefully, "are not in a very—" "Tell them," she said, and her voice came out with something in it she hadn't entirely planned. Not authority, exactly, though it had that shape. Something rawer than authority. Something that had been building for 4 months and 6 years simultaneously, and that had found its floor somewhere between wet asphalt and a dark stain on gray fabric. Harlan went to the secondary vehicle. Reyes picked up on the second ring. "The transfer went through," she said, 14 minutes ago. His voice was calm in the way that competent people's voices are calm when they've been waiting for something and it's finally arrived. "It's clean. We're already moving." "How fast?" "Fast. The 3 names alone. Carla Sims," she said, "attorney. She's inside the building, folding chair, probably hasn't moved. She was Damien's inside channel for 3 years. She has information about the operational structure that isn't in the files. Verbal, undocumented, the kind of thing that exists in a person's memory rather than a ledger. You need her talking before she calculates her options and lawyers up." A pause. "You're giving me your own attorney." "She was never mine," Vivian said. "I need federal agents at this location within 30 minutes. 20, Reyes said. "We've been staged since your ping." She lowered the phone. She stood on wet asphalt in the gray afternoon outside a warehouse that smelled like machine oil and bad decisions, and she thought about the next 30 minutes with the focused intensity of someone who has had a plan demolished and has built a new one in its rubble and is now running on the new one with everything she has left. There was still one thing that needed to happen before Reyes's people arrived. She walked to the secondary vehicle. Damien was in the back seat. His hands were bound with a zip tie, which was the functional choice, not the theatrical one. And he was sitting upright with the specific stillness of a man who had run his calculations and arrived at the conclusion that stillness was now the most strategic available posture. He had a cut above his left eyebrow that was still seeping. She could see it from the window before the door opened. And his gray suit was wrecked at the shoulder where someone had grabbed him, or taken him down, or both. There were 2 of Matteo's people in the car with him. They looked at Vivian when the door opened with an expression she recognized as the particular combination of loyalty and leashed anger that Matteo's people carried when Matteo was hurt, and the person responsible for it was 2 feet away. "I need 2 minutes, she said. Neither of them moved. 2 minutes, she said, outside the car. Stay where I can see you and you can see me. Nothing happens to him. She looked at each of them in turn. Matteo needs him coherent for what comes next. And what comes next is federal custody, which means any mark on him that happened after he was secured is a problem for everyone. Do you follow me? They followed her. They got out. She got in. She sat across from Damien in the back seat of the car, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Outside, through the windows, she could see the 2 men standing within 5 feet of the car. She could see Harlan talking on his phone. She could see the entrance to the warehouse, where a third of Matteo's people were managing whatever the interior currently contained, which included Carla. You sent the files, Damien said. Yes. To Federal. Yes. He nodded once, a small, precise movement. And the drive? Wiped itself on the second failed attempt. She paused. Everything that was on it was already in the transfer. He processed that with no visible reaction, which was impressive and also, she thought, meaningless at this point. The processing didn't change anything. The situation was what it was, and he was too intelligent not to know it. You planned the wipe, he said. I planned for the possibility that someone would try the drive. The second attempt was mine, deliberately wrong, to make your people think they had one more chance. She looked at him. The transfer went out when the progress bar hit 100%, before I pressed my actual thumb. The wipe was a separately triggered function that ran simultaneously. By the time your man tried the third attempt, everything was already gone and already sent. He looked at her for a long moment. You built a 2-track system. Yes. When? 7 months ago. When I first identified the magnitude of what you were building and understood that any single-track approach was too vulnerable to interference. She held his gaze. I built in the assumption that something would go wrong. I just didn't identify Carla as the specific point of failure. His jaw tightened slightly. Carla was... Don't. Her voice came out sharp and flat. Don't explain Carla to me. Don't tell me she had reasons, or that you gave her no choice, or that the situation was more complicated than I understand. I have spent 4 months documenting the things you do to people who are in complicated situations, and I am not interested in the framing. Silence. He looked out the window, at the warehouse, at the gray nothing of the afternoon. Marcus Chen, he said. Yes. You said you know where. I do. Then you know that it wasn't... He stopped. Wasn't what? He looked back at her, and for the first time, the only time, in all the interactions she'd cataloged across 47 encounters, she saw something in Damien Vale's face that she believed was genuine. Not the practiced warmth, not the calculation, something underneath both of those, something that had been buried long enough that it had to work to get to the surface. It looked like it cost him. It wasn't supposed to be Marcus, he said. She looked at him. There was a contractor who acted outside the parameters I'd established. The instruction was to remove Chen from the operational picture. Remove him, meaning sideline, discredit, relocate him, somewhere he couldn't... He stopped again. His jaw was tight. The contractor made a different decision. I found out after. She was very still. You're telling me, she said slowly, that Marcus Chen's death was not what you ordered. I'm telling you what happened. Which is not the same as an answer to my question. He looked at her, a long, direct, unperformed look. No, he said, it's not what I ordered. She sat with that for a moment. It didn't change the facts. It didn't change the outcome. Didn't change Marcus Chen. Didn't change Harrison Kell, or Sandra Dell, or any of the architecture of what Damien had built and what it had cost. But it was a piece she hadn't had, and she was honest enough with herself to register it as new information rather than absorbing it into the existing frame. The contractor, she said, is no longer a problem. That's not good enough. He's dead, Vivian. Flat, certain. 2 months after Marcus, he became a liability and he was handled. He paused. I'm not going to pretend that makes it better. I'm telling you the complete operational picture because you've earned it, and because in approximately 20 minutes I'm going to be in federal custody, and the complete picture is what's going to matter. She understood what he was doing. He was negotiating. Even now, contained, wrecked at the shoulder, blood drying above his eyebrow, he was negotiating. He was giving her information in the calculation that a fuller picture served some purpose for him in the proceedings that were coming. She also understood that the information might be true regardless of the calculation behind giving it. The contractor's name, she said, for the federal record, he told her. She filed it. Is there anything else, she said, that I need to know before the federal agents arrive that isn't in the files I've already sent? He was quiet for a moment. One thing, he said, tell me. The 6 names you gave Matteo, the people inside his organization on my payroll. He looked at her. 5 of them are correct. 1 of them isn't. She felt something move in her chest. Which one? Garrison. She ran Garrison through her memory. A mid-level logistics coordinator, she'd connected to Damien's network through 2 transactional records. and a pattern of communication that had seemed, in the context of everything else, unambiguous. The pattern was, Garrison has been running his own side operation for 3 years, Damien said, completely separate from mine. He's been skimming from Matteo's Eastern Territory accounts and routing it through a structure that superficially resembles mine because he built it using the same shell registry service. Different operation, different beneficiary, same architectural signature. He paused. When you found the signature, you attributed it to me. Understandably. But Garrison is not mine. Vivian was very still. Which means, she said carefully, that Matteo now believes Garrison is one of your people. Yes, and that the 6 names I gave him include a man who is guilty of embezzlement but not of working for you, in a context where Matteo is moving on all 6 of those names right now under the assumption that they're Damien Vale's network. Yes. She picked up the phone. She called Harlan. Garrison, she said, the moment he picked up. The name Garrison, on the list I gave Matteo. Do not move on him with the others. Separate him. Hold him separately and keep him away from... She stopped. Is Matteo reachable? He's in surgery, Harlan said. The word landed with a weight she hadn't prepared for. How serious, she said. But the doctor said... Harlan paused. She could hear him working with the words. The bullet was... It's serious, Mrs. Rourke. They're working on him now. She put the phone down in her lap. Damien was watching her. She didn't look at him. She looked at the window, at the warehouse entrance, at the ordinary gray afternoon that had no interest in the fact that the last 20 hours had dismantled everything she'd built and everything she'd tried to maintain, and possibly the person she'd been trying to protect from the building while also trying to leave. Vivian. Damien's voice. Quiet. She didn't respond. Whatever happens to Matteo, he said. It was not... Don't, she said. He didn't. She sat in the back seat of the car with the phone in her lap, and Damien Vale 2 feet away, and 2 of Matteo's people outside the window. And she did the thing she'd been not doing for 4 months, which was to stop managing and just sit inside the full weight of everything without organizing it. It lasted approximately 40 seconds. Then she picked up the phone and called Reyes back. I have additional information, she said. Verbal, not in the files. I need to give it to you before your people arrive because the sequence matters. She glanced at Damien. And I need you to know that Damien Vale is going to cooperate with the full proceedings in exchange for... I haven't agreed to that, Damien said. You will, she said. Not to Reyes, to Damien. Because the alternative is that I give Reyes the full operational history, including the contractor's name and the connection to Marcus Chen, and you have no leverage and no cooperation credit and nothing to negotiate with. She looked at him with the steadiest eyes she had. Or you cooperate fully, which gets you a process instead of a predetermined outcome. She paused. You're too practical not to take the process. The calculation ran across his face in the compressed, rapid way she'd learned to read in 6 years of watching men like Matteo and Damien make decisions in real time. Full cooperation, he said, in exchange for federal rather than state proceedings, and a formal record of the information I've provided. That's for Reyes to confirm, she said. She put the phone back to her ear. Reyes confirmed it in 40 seconds. She was giving Reyes the verbal information, the contractor's name, the garrison distinction, the operational detail about the 3 deaths that wasn't in the files, when the first federal vehicle came around the corner of the warehouse. Then a second, then a third. The next 2 hours were the specific kind of chaos that looks like order from a distance, because it is organized and sequential and follows established procedural lines, but which is, from inside it, just very fast and very loud and full of people asking questions that require complete answers delivered clearly under conditions that make clarity difficult. Vivian delivered them anyway. She sat in the back of a federal vehicle with a woman named Agent Torres, who had very short hair and a specific quality of attention that felt like being read by someone who was also simultaneously transcribing and fact-checking, and she went through everything, chronologically. From the first thread she'd pulled 8 months ago to the vendor discrepancy in the household accounts, to the complete evidentiary chain she'd built over 4 months to the events of the last 24 hours, including Carla's role and the lake house and the warehouse and what Damien had told her in the back seat of the other car. Torres asked good questions. Vivian answered all of them. At some point during the second hour, someone brought her coffee. She didn't know who. She drank it and kept talking. Harlan appeared at the vehicle window at the 90-minute mark. Torres looked at him, and then at Vivian. "Take a moment," Torres said. Vivian got out. Harlan looked at her with the 2-degree expression, and she looked back at him and waited. "He's out of surgery," Harlan said. She exhaled. "The bullet didn't—" He stopped. Restarted. "He's going to be okay. It's going to take time. But he's okay." She nodded. She stood on the pavement outside the federal vehicle in the late afternoon gray, and she processed the information the way she'd been processing everything for the last 4 months, by fitting it into the structure, by identifying what it meant for the sequence of events, by— She stopped. She let herself just feel it for a moment. The specific relief of it, not the strategic implications, not the sequence, just the fact itself. He's okay. It moved through her in a wave that she was not going to examine too carefully right now because there was still too much to do and she needed to be able to keep doing it. "Harlan," she said, "Mrs. Rourke. After this is finished, after Ria's people have everything they need and the federal hold is established, and the 6 names are properly sorted with Garrison separated, I need a hospital." "Of course. And I need it to be clear to everyone involved that I'm going because I choose to, not because Matteo asked." She paused. "Is that distinction possible to maintain?" Harlan considered it with the specific seriousness he applied to everything she said, which was one of the things she'd always respected about him. "I believe so," he said. She went back to Agent Torres. It was past 6 in the evening when they finished. The light had gone entirely, replaced by the amber gray of a city night that never got fully dark. And the warehouse district had acquired the particular atmosphere of a location where significant things have happened, and the significant things are now concluded, but the location hasn't caught up to that fact yet. Federal vehicles. Matteo's people's vehicles at bad angles. Carla's car, which she'd apparently driven here herself, parked near the side entrance with one wheel on the curb. Vivian stood outside the federal vehicle and looked at all of it. She thought about the night she'd packed the bag by the side table while Matteo was in the study. The 6 years of careful invisibility. The 4 months of meticulous, exhausting work in the margins of a life that had been slowly consuming her. The moment she'd set the ledger on the coffee table and said the thing she'd been rehearsing until it stopped being words and started being breath. She thought about what came next. Not the logistics. The logistics were in motion, Reyes had what he needed, the federal hold was established. Damian Vale was in custody and had committed to full cooperation. Carla was in a separate federal vehicle, having a very different kind of conversation with a very different agent. And Garrison was being held separately and would eventually be charged with things that had nothing to do with Damian's network and everything to do with his own. The logistics were not the problem. The problem was the thing after the logistics. The empty space that existed past the end of the plan, which she'd built in meticulous detail up to a certain point, and not beyond it, because she'd understood, somewhere around month 2, that there was no point in planning past the detonation of the thing, because she didn't know what the landscape looked like after the explosion. Now she was in the after. The landscape was a wrecked marriage to a man who was currently in a hospital recovering from surgery. A city that was about to learn the second most powerful figure in its criminal landscape had been arrested and would be cooperating with federal investigators. Her own name, which was going to appear in proceedings she could not fully control the framing of. And a future that was genuinely, completely, for the first time in 6 years, undetermined. She found she couldn't look directly at the undetermined future. Not yet. It was the way you can't look directly at something very bright, not because it's bad, but because the eyes haven't adjusted. Harlan appeared with a car that was not one of Matteo's operational vehicles. A clean car. An ordinary one. "Hospital," he said. She got in. Well, the hospital was 40 minutes away. She spent the drive going over the things she'd told Torres and the things she hadn't, and calibrating whether the balance was correct. It was mostly correct. There was one thing she'd kept back, not from strategic calculation, not this time, but from a simpler and more honest motive. The thing she'd kept back was what Damian had said about Marcus Chen, about the contractor acting outside his parameters, about it not being what he'd ordered. She'd kept it back because it wasn't her information to give. It was Matteo's. It belonged to him. The knowledge of it, the weight of it, the decision about what to do with it, in a way that nothing else in the entire evidentiary record did. Every other piece of information she'd built, she'd given freely because it was evidence and evidence belonged to the process. But Marcus Chen's death and the specific facts of how it had happened, and the one piece of information that complicated the simple, terrible story of it, that belonged to Matteo, and she was going to give it to him directly, and he was going to decide what to do with it. That was not a strategic calculation. It was just what felt right. She was surprised, a little, by how clearly she could feel that. By how clearly she could feel most things right now, actually. The relief about Matteo's surgery, the grief that moved through her when she thought about Marcus, the specific texture of the exhaustion that lived in her hands and her shoulders and behind her eyes. 4 months of not allowing herself to feel things in real time because feeling things in real time was a luxury of people who weren't building an evidentiary case against the man sharing the organization with their husband. She was feeling things in real time now. It was uncomfortable and disorganizing, and she was grateful for it in a way she hadn't expected. The hospital was a large regional medical center that smelled like every hospital she'd ever been in, which was a smell that was less about antiseptic and more about the specific weight of the air in places where important things are being decided about bodies. She followed the directions Harlan gave her and found herself on the 4th floor in a corridor that had a nurse's station at one end and a row of rooms along one side with curtained windows. Harlan had arranged, she didn't ask how, for her to go in. She stood outside the door for a moment. She was not nervous. She identified that clearly, not nervous. What she was something that didn't have a clean name, the state of a person about to enter a room where a conversation is going to happen that will determine the shape of a significant portion of their future, knowing that they cannot plan the conversation because the other person in it is also unplanned, also undetermined, also arriving at it from the wreckage of their own dismantled architecture. She pushed the door open. He was awake. She hadn't been certain he would be. The surgery had been recent and the recovery drugs would be doing what they did. But he was propped at an angle on the narrow hospital bed and his eyes were open, and they found her immediately when the door moved with the specific quickness of someone who has been waiting for a particular sound. He looked terrible. She said that to herself plainly and without flinching. He looked terrible. The color was still wrong, muted and washed, and the IV line ran into the back of his right hand, and his left side was heavily bandaged beneath the hospital gown in a way she was careful not to look at too directly. His hair was pushed back from his face in a way that didn't happen when he controlled it, which was always. His face, without the framework of the suit and the controlled environment and the role he wore as naturally as his own skin, was just a face. Just Matteo. Looking at her from a hospital bed like she was the fixed point again. She crossed the room. She sat in the chair beside the bed. She put her hands in her lap and looked at him, and he looked at her. And neither of them said anything for long enough that it started to have its own character. The silence. Not uncomfortable, not performing, just two people in a room after something enormous has happened, finding the first real quiet they've had in as long as either of them could accurately remember. He said, "Damien. Federal custody. He's cooperating. Carla. Federal custody. She'll cooperate because she has no better option. The files. Transmitted and received. Reyes has everything." He closed his eyes for a moment, opened them. "Marcus." "I know," she said. "I'm going to tell you something about Marcus. It's something Damien told me that I believe is true, and I'm going to give it to you, and then what you do with it is yours." He looked at her. She told him. She watched his face while she did it. Watched the information land, watched it move through him, watched the particular set of responses that a man has when he receives news about something. He's been grieving in one form and finds that the grief doesn't disappear but changes shape, becomes something adjacent to what it was, something that carries the same weight but distributes it differently. He didn't speak for a long time after she finished. "The contractor," he said finally. "Damien says he handled it 2 months after Marcus. I believe him. The name is on record with Federal." She paused. "What you do with that information personally is not something I can tell you." "I know." "Matteo." She waited until his eyes came back to her face. "I don't have a plan for what comes next." "Neither do I." "That's new." "Yes." A careful breath. The breath of someone managing a rib cage that had been through things. "It is." She looked at his hands, the IV line, the back of his right hand where the cannula went in, which had a piece of medical tape holding it down that was slightly crooked, the way medical tape always was, because no one thought about the aesthetics of it when there were more important things to manage. She reached over and straightened the tape. It was an absurd thing to do. She knew that. In the context of everything, the last 24 hours, the last 4 months, the 6 years before that, straightening a piece of medical tape was absurd and small and entirely without significance. Matteo looked at her hand on the back of his. "The herb garden," he said. She looked at him. "On the terrace. You stopped tending it in February." He was looking at her hand, not her face. "I noticed. I didn't say anything because I didn't know how to ask about it without—" He stopped. "I noticed." She thought about February. About the specific morning she'd stood on the terrace with a watering can and realized she'd stopped caring about the herbs, and that the not caring was the clearest evidence yet of what was happening to her inside the marriage. "I noticed a lot of things I didn't say anything about," he said. "So did I," she said. His hand turned under hers, slowly, carefully, with the deliberateness of a man managing the range of motion available to him, and his fingers found hers. She let them. Outside the hospital window, the city was doing what cities did at this hour, which was to move through the indifferent machinery of its own functioning without reference to the particular dramas being resolved or not resolved within its borders. Traffic, lights, the amber gray of a night that never went fully dark. Inside the room, Matteo's breathing had the careful quality it would have for some time, managing things that had been through things. His hand was in hers. The IV tape was straight. She thought, this is not a resolution. She thought, this is not even the beginning of a resolution. She thought, this is just two people in a room after something enormous, finding the quiet, not looking away. That was enough for right now. It had to be. Agent Torres called at 9:47. Vivian stepped into the corridor to take it, closing the door behind her softly. "We've completed the initial processing," Torres said. "Vale's cooperation has been formally documented. The 3 names, Kell, Dell, Chen, are now part of the primary federal record along with the contractor's identity. We'll need you available for further deposition over the next several weeks." "I understand." "There's one thing." Torres paused. The pause of someone who has done this long enough to know how to frame difficult information. "In the course of processing the files you transmitted, we found a secondary structure that wasn't in the original evidentiary package. A network layer that Damien Vale established more recently, in the last 6 months, as what appears to be a contingency against exactly this kind of exposure." Vivian was still. "What kind of contingency?" she said. "Financial," Torres said. "Primarily. But there's a component we're still assessing. I want you to be aware that the picture may be larger than what the files contain." "How much larger?" "We don't know yet." A pause. "Are you somewhere safe tonight?" Vivian looked at the closed door to Matteo's room. She thought about the contingency, about a man as careful and methodical as Damien Vale, who had spent 4 years building a parallel organization and who had known, on some level, that exposure was always a possibility. She thought about what a contingency built by a man like that might look like. And she thought about the fact that Damien was in federal custody and cooperating fully, and the contingency was now, if it was operational, if it was connected to people she didn't know about yet, running without its architect, which meant it was either inert or it was running on its own. "Mrs. Rourke," Torres said. "I'm here," Vivian said. "Are you somewhere safe?" She looked at the door. She thought about everything she'd built, and everything that had been demolished, and everything that had been transmitted, and everything that was still, apparently, unknown. "I'm working on it," she said. She ended the call. She stood in the hospital corridor under the flat institutional light and thought about the secondary structure Torres had described, and what it might contain, and who might be connected to it, and whether the last 24 hours had closed something or merely changed its shape. She thought about going back into the room. She thought about what she was going to tell Matteo, and she thought, standing in a hospital corridor at 9:47 in the evening with her hands in the pockets of a coat she'd been wearing since the lake house, that she was about to find out whether the thing she'd built over 4 months was the end of something or only the beginning of the harder part. She pushed the door open. Matteo looked up. "Torres," she said, "I heard you on the phone." His voice was careful, conserving. What did she say? Vivian came back into the room. She sat in the chair. She looked at him. There's a contingency, she said. Something Damien built in the last 6 months. A secondary structure. Federal is still assessing what it is. She paused. It may be nothing. It may be operational. He looked at her. His face did the thing. The recalibration, the rapid silent calculation, the update. What do you need? He said. And that was the question that mattered, she realized. Not what do we do or what's the plan or any of the other framings that put the two of them in separate positions with separate resources and separate strategies. Just, what do you need? Directed at her. From a hospital bed. With an IV in his hand and a bandaged side and the complete wreckage of his empire somewhere out in the city, doing whatever empires did when their architect was in a hospital room and their second-in-command was in federal custody. She thought about what she needed. She thought about it honestly, without the strategic filter, without the calculation. I need to know what's in the contingency, she said, before it knows we're looking at it. He nodded. Harlan, he said. Yes. He's outside. He's always outside. Tell him to come in. She stood. She went to the door. She put her hand on the frame and looked back at him. At Matteo Rourke in a hospital bed at 9:47 at night, with everything he'd built in ruins around him and his empire gone, and his most trusted lieutenant in federal custody and a bullet's recent work in his side. And she thought about the words she'd said to him 2 nights ago in the penthouse. Enough. She thought about it differently now. Not as a closing word, not as the word that ended something, as the word that meant, this is the floor. This is what's left after everything else is stripped. This, right here, is where we find out what we actually are. She opened the door. Harlan, she said. He was there. Of course he was. We have a problem, she said. A new one. She looked at him with the eyes of a woman who had spent 4 months in the margins and was done with margins. I need everything Matteo's people have on Damien's activity in the last 6 months. Not the financial records, the operational movements. People, locations, contacts, anything that doesn't appear in what I already built. Harlan looked at her. He looked past her at Matteo. Something passed between them. The compressed communication of 2 people who have worked in the same space long enough to transmit entire understandings in a glance. Then Harlan looked back at Vivian. Yes, he said. Tonight, she said. It needs to start tonight. And the night, which had seemed for a moment like it might be the end of something, opened back up in front of her like a road she hadn't finished driving. The contingency had a name. Harlan found it at 11:40 at night, sitting at the small table in the corner of Matteo's hospital room with a laptop. Vivian didn't ask where he'd gotten, working through the operational movement records with the systematic patience of a man who had spent 20 years finding things that other people had tried to make unfindable. He found it the way you find things that have been carefully hidden, not by looking for them directly, but by following the negative space around them, the absences, the places where something should be and isn't. The name was Aldrich, not a person, a protocol. A set of instructions that Damien had embedded into the secondary structure 6 months ago, designed to activate automatically under specific conditions. Conditions that included Damien's arrest, or his extended communications blackout, or both simultaneously. Aldrich was running. Vivian read the summary Harlan put in front of her and felt the specific cold of a problem that is larger than you had planned for settling into her chest. What does it do? She said. 3 things, Harlan said. He kept his voice low. Matteo was awake on the other side of the room, but conserving, which was the word she'd started using internally for the way he held himself when the pain was managed but present. First, it begins liquidating the secondary financial structure, moving assets out of the shell network into clean accounts before Federal can freeze them. Second, it sends a set of encrypted messages to a list of contacts. We don't have the list yet. Third, he paused. Third, she said. Third, it contains instructions for a person Damien identified as a failsafe. Someone outside the network. Someone not in any of your files, not in the Federal record, not in anything we currently have access to. He looked at her. Someone whose job, under Aldrich, is to make sure that anyone who enabled Damien's exposure doesn't get to enjoy the outcome. The room was very quiet. "How long has it been running?" she said, based on the activation timestamp, "since approximately 8 p.m. tonight." She looked at the time on the laptop. 11:47. Nearly 4 hours. "The failsafe," she said. "Man or woman?" "We don't know." "Last known location?" "We don't have one." She stood up. She thought about the liquidation first because the liquidation was potentially stoppable. If Reyes could get a freeze on the secondary accounts before the assets moved completely, the financial component of Aldrich collapsed on its own. She called Torres. Torres picked up on the first ring, which told Vivian that Torres had not been sleeping. "The secondary structure has an activation protocol," Vivian said. "It's liquidating right now. How fast can Federal freeze the accounts in the Shell network?" "We've been watching for movement since 9, Torres said. "We flagged unusual activity 30 minutes ago. The freeze request is already in front of a duty judge." "How long?" 20 minutes, maybe less. "The assets that have already moved, we'll trace them. Some will be gone. Most won't." Torres paused. "That's not what's worrying you." "No." "The message protocol." "And the failsafe." A longer pause. "We identified the message sends 20 minutes ago. We're working on the recipient list. It's encrypted in a layer we haven't cracked yet." Torres's voice had the quality of someone managing a great deal of simultaneous information. "The failsafe. You know about the failsafe." "Harlan found the protocol structure. We don't have an identity." "Neither do we. Yet." Torres paused. "Mrs. Rourke, I need you and anyone connected to this case to relocate to a secured location tonight. We have a federal safe house. I'm not leaving the hospital." "That's not... Matteo is post-surgery. I'm not leaving." She said it without inflection, which was a different kind of statement than saying it with force. Force could be argued with. Flatness just described the situation. "I need you to find the fail-safe identity faster than they can reach us." "We're working on it." "Work faster," she said, and ended the call. She turned to Harlan. "The hospital security," she said. "I've already spoken to them. And I have 4 people in the building, 2 on this floor, 1 at each entrance." He met her eyes. "It's not ideal." "No," she said. "It's not." She went back to Matteo. I was watching her from the bed. He'd been watching her through the whole phone call, which she'd conducted 6 feet from him in a room with no ambient noise, so he'd heard at minimum her side of it, and had probably assembled the rest from context. He was good at assembling from context. "Failsafe," he said. "Yes." "Damien's." "Built into the activation protocol. It triggered at 8 p.m. when he went into custody and lost communications." She sat in the chair. She looked at him directly. "Someone we don't have an identity for, with instructions to remove anyone who contributed to Damien's exposure." "That means you." "Primarily, yes." "And me." "Probably." He looked at the ceiling for a moment. She watched his chest move with the careful breath. Then he looked back at her. "Harlan has people in the building," he said. 4. "I need to make a call." "Matteo?" "Not operational." He held her gaze. "There's someone who owes me a significant debt. Former law enforcement. He's been out of active work for 3 years, but he knows how to find people in the kind of network Damien ran." A pause. "He's also someone Damien would never have flagged as a threat because to Damien's knowledge, he and I haven't spoken in 6 years." She looked at him. "Have you?" she said. "Once. 8 months ago, off record." He watched her process that. "I had started to notice things about Damien, small things, nothing I could articulate. I reached out to someone who could look at them without being inside the organization." She absorbed this. "You were investigating Damien," she said slowly, "before I built the ledger." "I was suspicious. I wasn't investigating." He paused. "I didn't have your patience." She thought about 8 months ago, the same 8 months ago when she'd pulled the first thread from the household account discrepancy. The same window. Both of them noticing something wrong, neither of them telling the other, both of them working alone in the particular isolation that their marriage had become. "His name," she said, "Caldwell. He runs a private consulting firm in the Eastmoor district. His real business is finding people." A breath. "He'll answer if I call." "Make the call," she said. He made it. She sat in the chair and listened to one side of a conversation that was clipped and specific and revealed almost nothing to anyone who wasn't already inside the framework it referenced. Matteo described the situation in the compressed shorthand of someone who had a long history of communicating under conditions where compression was necessary. He listened. He asked 2 questions. He ended the call. 40 minutes, he said. For what? Caldwell will have an identity. He has contacts inside 3 of the networks Damien used for contractor sourcing. If the failsafe came from one of those networks, and he thinks the protocol structure suggests it did, he can cross-reference the activation signature against known assets. Vivian looked at the time. 12:06. 40 minutes was 12:46. She thought about the 4 hours Aldrich had already been running, about the encrypted message recipients Torres was working to identify, about the liquidation that was being raced against a federal freeze order in front of a duty judge somewhere in the city. She thought about the failsafe, whoever they were, whatever they looked like, wherever they currently were in the city, and she thought about the fact that a competent professional with a clear instruction and 4 hours of head start was not a comfortable thing to wait 40 minutes on. She picked up the secondary phone and called Reyes directly. The message protocol, she said when he answered. The encrypted sends. How close are you to the recipient list? 15 minutes, maybe 20? It's a layered cipher and our analyst is... She heard him turn away from the phone, say something she couldn't make out. Then back. 10 minutes. She says 10. I need to know if any of the recipients are geographically close to this hospital. A pause. You think the failsafe was on the list? I think if Damien was careful, and he was always careful, he didn't just embed standing instructions in a protocol. He had a person on standby, and a person on standby would have needed to receive a location at activation. She paused. If the message list includes someone within range of this hospital, that's the failsafe. 10 minutes, Reyes said. She lowered the phone. Matteo was watching her with the expression she'd started to think of as his real face. Not the Empire face, not the controlled negotiation face, but the version underneath all of that, which was tired and focused and entirely without performance. You should sleep, she said. I'm not going to sleep. You're post-surgery. I'm aware. Matteo, Vivian, he said it quietly. I'm not going to sleep while someone with instructions to remove you is active somewhere in this city. That's not something I'm capable of, regardless of what my body has been through today, so please stop suggesting it. She looked at him. She thought about the night of the penthouse, about walking through the door and not looking back, about the elevator and the 60 seconds in the parking garage and the drive through the city while rain hammered every surface. She thought about how far they were from that night in linear time, less than 48 hours, and how completely different the terrain was now. I know, she said. I know you're not going to sleep. She paused. I'm not going to tell you to, again. Something moved in his face, barely visible. The 2-degree shift, but on Matteo's face rather than Harlan's. Thank you, he said. They waited. Reyes called at 12:19. The recipient list has 11 names. We're running all of them. One of them. He stopped, and she heard in the stop the shape of significant information being framed carefully. One of them is a burner number that pinged a cell tower 6 blocks from your current location 12 minutes after the message was sent. 6 blocks. 12 minutes after 8 p.m., which meant they'd been moving toward the hospital since 8:12. It was now 12:19, 4 hours. Description, she said. Do you have anything? The burner account has a purchase record. It was bought with cash at a convenience store in the Northgate district 3 weeks ago. Store had exterior camera coverage. She heard keyboard sounds. The image quality is poor, but our analyst is working it. Female, mid-30s, dark coat. A pause. That's what we have right now. Female, mid-30s, dark coat. She looked at Harlan. Female, mid-30s, dark coat, she said. Harlan's eyes moved to the door, then back to her. He stood up from the table and went to the door in 4 steps and opened it and said something to whoever was in the corridor that she couldn't hear. He came back. My people are looking, he said, 12:23. She stood in the middle of the hospital room and thought about the geometry of it. A person who had been 6 blocks away at 8:12 and who had 4 hours. A hospital with multiple entrances that Harlan had covered with 4 people. a fourth floor with a nurse's station and a row of rooms. She thought about how she herself had gotten into this building. Harlan had arranged it, which meant the arrangement involved someone at the facility who had accommodated it. Which meant the facility was not impermeable to a person who was determined and patient and had had 4 hours. She looked at Matteo. "I need you to move," she said. "What?" "I need you in a different room, right now." She was already at the door. "Harlan!" "Ahead of you," Harlan said. The next 4 minutes were the kind of minutes that compress in memory, fast and fragmented and physical in a way that didn't leave space for anything except the next immediate movement. Harlan's people helped Matteo off the bed with the IV stand, and the controlled wincing of a man who did not make sounds when he was in pain, because making sounds was a form of surrender, he didn't extend to physical injury. They moved him 3 rooms down the corridor to a room that was unoccupied and unlisted at the nurse's station, and one of Harlan's people stayed with him while Harlan and Vivian went back to the original room, and the door closed, and they stood in it. "If she's in the building," Harlan said. "She's had 4 hours. She's in the building." He nodded. His hand was inside his jacket, which told her what was there without requiring her to think about it. "You should be with Matteo," he said. "She'll check the original room first. She'll have a room number, either through the admission record or through whatever access she's established in 4 hours. She'll come here first." "That's a significant assumption." "It's a calculated one." She looked at the door. "Harlan, do your people know what to do when they find her? Not if. When?" "Yes. Federal custody, not—" "I know." His voice was very level. "Federal custody. Intact and talking." He looked at her. "That's not what Matteo's people would do on their own." "I know. But it's what they're going to do tonight." He held her gaze for a moment. Then, "Yes." She stood in the room she'd moved Matteo out of, and she waited. It took 9 minutes. The door didn't open dramatically. It opened the way a door opens when someone has assessed the situation on the other side and determined that the direct approach is less complicated than whatever alternative exists. She came in with the specific, purposeful movement of a professional, and she was wearing a hospital auxiliary volunteer jacket over the dark coat Reyes's analyst had described, which was the kind of detail that was both obvious in retrospect and invisible in the moment, because the human mind fills in the expected picture, and a person in a volunteer jacket in a hospital corridor is part of the expected picture. She saw Vivian immediately. She stopped. She was mid-30s. She had the look of someone who had spent a long time being very good at a thing that required stillness and patience and the ability to be in places without being remembered as having been there. Her face was not memorable. That was probably intentional. Vivian looked at her, and the woman looked at Vivian, and 3 seconds passed that were very quiet. Harlan came out of the bathroom at the room's far end. He didn't say anything. The woman looked at him. She looked at his jacket. She looked back at Vivian. "Where is he?" she said. Her voice was flat and professional. "Somewhere you won't find tonight," Vivian said. The woman assessed the room, the exits, Harlan's position, the IV stand still in place beside the empty bed. She was running calculations. Vivian could see it, the same compressed rapid assessment she'd watched on Damien's face in the back of the car, on Matteo's face across 100 situations, on her own face in mirrors when she was working through something that required all of her available processing. She arrived at her conclusion. She put her hands up. Not in surrender exactly, in acknowledgement. The distinction was slight, but Vivian felt it. "Damien is in federal custody," Vivian said. "I know. He's cooperating fully with the investigation." "I know that too." "The protocol that activated tonight, Aldrich, is collapsed. The financial structure is frozen. The message recipients are being identified and detained." Vivian looked at her steadily. "The structure you were part of is finished, not paused, not damaged. Finished." The woman said nothing. "Your name is going to be on a list by morning regardless of what happens in the next 5 minutes," Vivian said. "The question is whether it appears on that list as a cooperating witness or as something else." She paused. "Damien is cooperating. Carla Sims is cooperating. The person who gave Matteo Damien's location tonight was cooperating. Everyone who had something to offer and chose to offer it is getting a process instead of a predetermined outcome." She looked at the woman's face. "You were 4 hours too late. That's not a failure of execution. The situation moved faster than the protocol anticipated. That's not your fault, and it's not a reason to make a worse choice than you have to make right now. Another silence. The woman lowered her hands to her sides. I want an attorney present before I say anything, she said. That's a smart thing to want, Vivian said. Harlan made the call. Her name was Petra Voss. Vivian learned that 3 days later, when Torres briefed her on the full picture of who Aldrich had been and how Damien had built it, and what Petra Voss's role in the network had looked like over the previous 18 months. Voss had been a contractor, not one of the ones connected to the 3 deaths, a separate function, the contingency function, which Damien had apparently maintained as a distinct track from his operational activity because he was, as Vivian had told Reyes months ago, the kind of careful that other people mistook for paranoid until the carefulness turned out to have been the right call. Voss was cooperating. The federal case was, in Torres's words, the most comprehensively documented organized crime exposure she'd worked in 14 years of federal investigations. She said it without particular warmth, as a statement of professional assessment, and Vivian received it the same way. The 3 days between the hospital room and the Torres briefing were not easy days. They were the days in which the decision Vivian had made to build the ledger, to walk out, to transmit the files, to give Reyes everything, produced its full range of consequences, which were complicated and various and did not resolve cleanly into any single category of outcome. Matteo's organization, as it had existed, was finished. Not because the federal case destroyed it directly. The case targeted Damien's network primarily, with Matteo's operation as the context rather than the subject. But because the exposure of the secondary structure and the 4 years of Damien's parallel building had, in Torres's assessment, compromised every major operational relationship Matteo had maintained. The people who had done business with Matteo Rourke did so on the basis of specific assumptions about security and insularity and the reliability of the structure. Those assumptions were no longer sustainable. Matteo knew this. He'd known it, Vivian thought, before she did. She found that out on the second day, when he was moved from the ICU floor to a recovery room, and she was there when his financial people came to brief him on the status of his accounts and assets. She sat in the corner and watched him listen to the brief with the controlled face. Not the Empire face, not the performance, but the version that emerged when he was managing something painful by not allowing the pain into his expression. He asked 2 questions. Then he told his people to begin the process of surrendering the remaining accounts connected to the criminal operation to federal authorities. The financial people looked at each other. One of them said, Matteo, there are assets in the secondary structure that federal hasn't identified yet. If we move carefully, we can— No, Matteo said. The exposure isn't complete. There's still— No. His voice had the flatness she'd heard in the hospital room when he was conserving. Surrender the accounts, all of them. Work with Carver on the legal framework for voluntary cooperation. He looked at the man who'd spoken. I'm not rebuilding. Do you understand what I mean by that? The man understood. He didn't like it. He left. Vivian stayed in the corner until the financial people were gone. Then she stayed there a while longer because she was thinking about what she'd just witnessed, which was a man dismantling the most significant structure of his adult life, not because he was forced to, but because he decided to, and she was trying to understand what that felt like from inside it, and finding that she couldn't, not entirely, because she hadn't built what he'd built, and so she couldn't know the specific weight of choosing to take it apart. Matteo looked at her from the bed. You're thinking, he said. I'm always thinking. You're thinking loudly, for someone who doesn't make any noise. She looked at him. I was thinking about what it cost to do what you just did. More than most things. He held her gaze. Less than not doing it. She nodded. She didn't say anything else about it. The Torres briefing was on a Thursday morning in a federal building that smelled like carpet cleaner and institutional coffee, in a conference room with a long table and windows that looked onto an interior courtyard where a single tree was doing something optimistic with its available light. Torres went through the full picture in the compressed, sequential way of someone who has worked in facts long enough to find narrative unnecessary. The Aldrich Protocol. Petra Voss. The recipient list, which had included 11 people in 4 states and 2 countries, all now identified and processed in various jurisdictions. The 3 deaths, Kell, Dell, Chen, formally entered into the federal record with the evidentiary chain Vivian had built, plus Damien's corroborating cooperation and the contractor's identity, who was confirmed deceased, which closed that thread without the possibility of further proceedings, but also without any remaining doubt about what had happened. Carla Sims had entered a formal cooperation agreement. The proceedings related to her 3 years of information sharing would take time to resolve, but the cooperation agreement was in place, and her attorney had negotiated the terms that her cooperation merited. Damien Vale's formal cooperation was documented and expansive. Torres described it as the most comprehensive self-implication she'd seen from a primary subject in a complex case. Vivian thought about the back seat of the car, about Damien's face when she'd said no to his offer, about the way calculation and something that was almost respect had run across him simultaneously. He was practical. She'd told him that. He'd chosen the process. When Torres finished, she looked at Vivian across the long table. "The case goes to grand jury in 6 weeks, she said. "We'll need you available for testimony, your role throughout, the 4 months of documentation, the transmission of the files, the events at the warehouse, is central to the evidentiary narrative." "I understand. There will be aspects of your own knowledge of Matteo's operation that the defense will attempt to use against the case. We need to be prepared for that." "I've been prepared for that since month 1, Vivian said. Torres looked at her for a moment. "You built this very carefully," she said. "Yes. Most people in your position would have found a way not to." Vivian thought about that. She thought about February, about the morning she'd stood on the terrace with a watering can and understood that the herbs were dying because she'd stopped caring whether they lived, and that the not caring was the clearest signal yet of what was happening to her, inside a life that had slowly, incrementally stopped being hers. "I'm not most people," she said, "and it wasn't a position. It was a marriage." She paused. "That's why it was difficult." Torres nodded. The meeting ended. "What?" 3 weeks later, Matteo was released from medical care. He'd been in the hospital for 11 days and in a supervised recovery residence for the remaining time. And on the morning he was cleared for discharge, he sat in a chair by the window of the recovery room and looked like a man who had taken a significant physical event and was carrying it honestly rather than pretending it hadn't happened. He was thinner. The silver at his temples was more visible against the diminished color in his face. He held himself with the slight physical care of someone who knew precisely where the boundary was between comfortable movement and the kind that cost something, and he stayed on the right side of it without making it a performance. Vivian drove him. It wasn't a penthouse they drove to. The penthouse was gone, not seized, surrendered, part of the voluntary cooperation framework his attorney had constructed. He'd arranged an apartment through the same legal process in a neighborhood she didn't know, and which had nothing to do with any address she'd ever associated with his former life. She drove him there and parked and walked with him up 3 flights because there was no elevator, which he negotiated without comment, and she unlocked the door with the key he'd given her, a regular key, not a card, not a code, a physical metal key, and they went inside. The apartment was furnished, not elaborately, clean lines, functional, the furniture of someone who'd started from scratch without needing to perform starting from scratch. A kitchen that was actual size, windows that looked onto a street with trees that were doing what the tree in the federal building courtyard had been doing, the thing with the available light. He stood in the middle of the living room and looked at it. She stood near the door. "It's small," he said. "Yes. I haven't lived anywhere small since I was 22. How does it feel?" He considered the question with the seriousness she'd learned to expect when she asked him questions that deserved seriousness. "Accurate," he said. She looked at him. "It's the right size," he said, "for what's left." She thought about the right size for what was left. She thought about her own situation, the apartment she'd arranged for herself in a different neighborhood, the woman named Delphine who'd managed it without asking questions, the way she'd been living for the past weeks in spaces that were hers in a way no space had been in 6 years. She thought about the separate apartments, the separate neighborhoods, the separate keys. She thought about what Matteo had done in the recovery room when his financial people came. About the 2 questions and the instruction and the word no said twice with the flatness of a decision rather than a performance. She thought about what a person becomes when they strip away the thing they built their identity around. Not immediately, not in a week or 3 weeks, but over time. Whether the person underneath the empire was someone worth knowing. She didn't know yet. She knew she was finding out. "Matteo," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not moving back in," she said. "I want to say that clearly so there's no version of this afternoon where you have a different understanding than I do." "I know," he said. "I have my own place." "I know that too. I'm not—" She stopped, restarted. "I don't know what we are. I know what we were, and I know that we're not that anymore. And I know that whatever comes next isn't going to be simple or fast or arranged in advance." She looked at him. "I needed to say that out loud so it exists between us as a fact rather than an assumption." He was quiet for a moment. "Can I say something?" he said. "Yes." "I'm not expecting anything from you. I want you to know that." He held her gaze across the small living room of the accurate-sized apartment. "Not a timeline, not a decision, not any particular form of—" He stopped, and she watched him work with the words the way he worked with physical limitations, finding the line. "I spent 6 years making decisions about our life without including you. I'm not going to start the next part by deciding what it looks like." She looked at him. She thought, "This is either the truest thing he has ever said to me, or it is another version of a man who is very good at understanding what a situation requires." She thought, "I don't actually know which. And I'm not sure he does either. And maybe not knowing is the most honest place either of us has ever been." "Okay," she said. He nodded. She stayed for 2 hours. They sat at the kitchen table, the table that was functional and not performing anything. And she told him the full details of the Torres briefing, the things she'd kept to the periphery of their hospital conversations, the complete picture of what Aldrich had been and what Petra Voss had said in her cooperation sessions and what the grand jury timeline looked like. He listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions, both precise. He processed the information the way he processed everything, densely, rapidly, arriving at the geometry of the situation before she'd finished mapping it. At one point, she told him the thing about Marcus. The full version, not the compressed version she'd given him in the hospital, but the complete account of what Damien had said in the back of the car. The contractor's decision, the instruction that had been exceeded. The thing Damien had said that she'd believed and still believed. Matteo was quiet for a long time. "It doesn't change what happened," he said finally. "No." "But it changes—" He stopped. "What it means about Damien," she said quietly. "Yes." He looked at the table. "Which doesn't make it better, but it makes it—" Another stop. The words were working against something in him. She could see it. "It makes it different than I thought it was." "Yes." "I don't know what to do with that yet." "You don't have to know yet." He looked up at her. "You said that to me in the hospital, about the herb garden." "You don't have to know everything immediately," she said. "That's a thing I keep learning and keep forgetting and keep having to learn again." Something in his face moved. Not the 2-degree shift, not the controlled calibration, but something fuller and less organized and more human. "I'm going to cooperate fully with the federal proceedings," he said. "Everything. Not just the accounts, the operational history, the contacts, the structure of everything I built for the past 12 years. Whatever they need." He held her gaze. "I want you to know that's not a calculation. It's not a trade. It's just what has to happen." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "Do you?" "Yes." She meant it. He nodded. She left at 4 in the afternoon. She walked home. Not the whole distance. It was across the city, and her apartment was a 40-minute drive from his neighborhood. So she walked until she found a route she liked, and then she caught a bus and sat by the window and watched the city do its indifferent machinery for a while. She thought about the herb garden. She'd been back to the penthouse exactly once, in the company of an attorney and a federal marshal, to collect the personal belongings that had been categorized as hers under the voluntary cooperation framework. She'd walked through the rooms she'd decorated and then stopped decorating, and she'd stood on the terrace for a moment. The herb garden was dead. The plants she'd tended every morning through 3 seasons and then stopped tending in February had gone to dry sticks in their pots, which was what happened to plants that nobody tended. She'd stood there looking at it for a while. Then she'd taken nothing from the terrace and gone back inside and collected the things that were hers and left. In her own apartment, she had a window that faced east. She'd bought 2 small pots from the hardware store below and put them on the windowsill. She'd planted basil in one because basil was easy and she needed to start with something easy. She'd planted rosemary in the other because rosemary was harder and she needed something to work toward. Both of them were alive. She tended them every morning. She got off the bus 4 stops before her apartment and walked the rest of the way because the evening was doing something acceptable with the available light, the way the trees in 2 separate courtyards had been doing something optimistic, and she was finding that she wanted to be in the middle of that rather than moving through it in a vehicle. She walked with her hands in her coat pockets, and she thought about the next 6 weeks and the grand jury and the deposition schedule Torres had outlined. She thought about what it would be like to sit in a room and give formal testimony about 4 months of her life that had been built in the margins of a marriage that was ending while she built it. She thought it would be exhausting and necessary, and probably the most important thing she would do in a long time. She thought about Carla. She hadn't spoken to Carla since the warehouse. She didn't know if she would. There was a version of the future in which she did, in which the 22 years of friendship that had existed before 3 years of betrayal were worth trying to understand rather than simply ending. And there was a version in which she didn't, in which the wound was too specifically shaped for reconciliation to find purchase. She hadn't decided. She wasn't going to decide yet. She turned onto her street. The hardware store below her apartment had a light on in the back even at this hour, the light of someone working late on something that required more time than the day provided. She liked that about it. She liked that she lived above a place where people worked on things with their hands. She unlocked the door. She went upstairs. She put the kettle on and stood at the east-facing window and looked at the 2 pots on the sill. The basil was doing well. The rosemary was doing what rosemary did, which was to resist visibly and then take root when it decided you'd earned it. She pressed 2 fingers against the soil in the rosemary pot, still moist from this morning's water. She looked at the city through the window, the amber gray of the night that never went fully dark. The ordinary and continuous movement of a place that had no investment in the specific dramas of the people moving through it. She thought about a word she'd said 6 weeks ago in a penthouse with rain hammering the windows, said to a man who was standing in the middle of a living room with an empire behind him and nothing in front of him yet. Enough. She thought about what the word had meant then and what it meant now, standing in her own kitchen in an apartment above a hardware store with 2 small plants on the windowsill. Then, I'm done. I've had enough. Enough of this. Now it meant something different. Now it meant this. This is enough. The basil, the rosemary that was taking its time, the east-facing window, the kettle coming to boil behind her, the key in her pocket, a regular metal key that opened a door that was hers, the black ledger that had been on a coffee table and then in a federal evidence file, and then in the form of everything it had documented and transmitted and set in motion, distributed across a body of proceedings that would take years to complete. No longer a secret, no longer leverage, just a record, sitting in the appropriate place, doing what records were supposed to do. The kettle clicked off. She made tea. She sat at her table and let the cup warm her hands and watched the window and didn't plan anything for the next 20 minutes, which was longer than she'd managed to not plan in 4 months. And the not planning felt like the appropriate thing, the earned thing, the thing that came after you had done what needed doing and paid what it cost, and were now in the room on the other side of it. She thought about Matteo in his accurate-sized apartment. She thought about whether the person underneath the empire, given time and distance and the specific pressure of genuine consequence, was someone she wanted to find out about. She thought, yes. She thought, but not yet. Not quickly. Not because it's the next planned thing. She thought, maybe that's the most honest place to end up. Not knowing the ending, not having the plan, just being present enough to find out what comes next when it comes. The tea was the right temperature. She drank it. Outside the window, the city moved through its indifferent machinery, and the rosemary on the sill was taking its time, and the night that never went fully dark did its amber gray best, and Vivian Cross sat at her table in her apartment with her key in her pocket and her hands around a warm cup and did not look away from any of it. That was all. That was enough.